long before kingdoms were carved in stone, before the names of kings echoed across the sands, there was the river. The Nile, ancient and eternal, flowed northward through a land not yet called Nubia. Its waters sliced through a corridor of rocky hills and golden plains, giving life where none should be. Here, in the region south of Egypt, the river did not merely nourish the land, it shaped the very rhythm of human life. This southern stretch of the Nile, known to later Egyptians as Tar Seti, the land of the bow, bore witness to some of Africa's earliest human communities. It was a narrow belt of green, hemmed by desert cliffs, a fragile lifeline for those who settled along its banks. They were hunters, fishermen, and gatherers at first. Over time, they planted barley and millet, raised cattle, built villages of mud brick and stone. As their flint blades dulled and pottery gained form, so too did their understanding of the world around them deepen. The earliest of these communities, dating back over 7,000 years, left behind traces in the soil, grave goods, stone tools, decorated ceramics. These people were the ancestors of what would become one of Africa's great civilizations. They were not Egyptian. They were older, in some ways, and different. Their hearts were tied not to pyramids, but to the rhythms of the savannah, to cattle herding, and to local deities who whispered from the rocks and water. As centuries passed, these communities along the Nile's southern reaches developed cultural patterns distinct from those of their northern neighbors. While Egypt built its pyramids and temples, the people of this region cultivated their own sacred spaces and social hierarchies. And while Egypt wrote in hieroglyphs, Nubian voices were carved into the patterns of burial mounds, in the clustering of cattle skulls, and in the shapes of stone circles whose meanings are still not fully known. The land was rich in gold, that eternal lure of empires, and copper, ivory, ebony, and incense. These treasures flowed northward along trade routes, attracting the eyes of foreign rulers. But long before any pharaoh looked southward with desire, these people had already begun to weave together a way of life rooted in balance, between flood and drought, between the harsh silence of the desert and the ceaseless murmur of the Nile. To the west lay the Libyan sands. To the east, the rugged Red Sea hills. But here in the central corridor of the Nile, early Nubian life flourished. It was not yet a kingdom, nor a dynasty. But it was a beginning. And so the river remembered. It remembered the footsteps of the first settlers. The songs of women grinding grain beside the floodplain. The cries of children born in reed-thatched huts. The calls of cattle in the morning mist. It remembered the feel of sandals pressing into wet silt. And it remembered the first stone set down to build the tombs of leaders whose names have been lost. In time, the river would carry stories further still of kings and queens, war and peace, triumph and eclipse. But here, in the very beginning, it simply flowed, holding within its currents the promise of all that was to come. For this was the seedbed of Nubia, and the river watched it grow. In the deep curve of the Nile between the third and fourth cataracts, where the desert meets fertile floodplain, a new power stirred. Its name would echo across centuries, Kerma. Kerma was no village. It was no outpost of a foreign kingdom. It was something older and more sovereign, a city born of the land itself, rising from the soil it tended, the cattle it raised, and the traditions it kept. By 2500 BCE, it had grown into a true capital, the beating heart of what historians now call the Kerma culture. Here, the people built grand homes from mud brick, raised burial mounds for their kings, and conducted rituals in temples shaded by wooden pillars. Their tombs, vast and circular, housed not only the dead but the echoes of their world, ivory combs, gold jewelry, finely crafted ceramics, and the bones of cattle and companions buried in honor. This was not a reflection of Egypt to the north. Kerma stood apart. Though the Egyptians saw Nubia as a land of wretched foreigners, a place to extract gold, cattle, and slaves, Kerma was never fully subdued. When Egyptian pharaohs marched south in campaigns of conquest, they encountered not scattered tribes but a kingdom organized and proud. Even when Egyptian fortresses dotted the Nile frontier, the people of Kerma endured, and eventually, they pushed back. At the height of its power, around 1700 BCE, Kerma reached out beyond its riverbanks. Its kings forged alliances with Egypt's enemies, notably the Hyksos, who ruled northern Egypt at the time, and launched raids deep into Egyptian territory. At least once, Kerma's warriors reached as far as Asyut, well into the Nile heartland. Kerma's wealth lay not only in its own fields and mines, but in the crossroads it controlled. Gold from the southern hills, incense from the east, cattle from the west, all passed through Kerma's gates. Its artisan-shaped tools of bronze, glazed pottery in hues of blue and red, and adorned their dead with the goods of distant lands. But it was not only trade or war that defined Kerma. There was a sacredness in their way of life, in their reverence for ancestors, in the placement of their burial tumuli, in the quiet order of their city. They built a grand religious structure, today known by archaeologists as the Western Defufa, a massive mud brick edifice whose exact function is still debated, but which clearly marked Kerma as a place of both worldly and spiritual authority. This, then, was a civilization of dignity. Not a shadow of Egypt, but its equal in complexity, culture, and courage. While pharaohs built in stone, Kerma built in earth, and though time eroded its walls, it could not erase its memory. In the centuries to come, Kerma would face the full force of Egyptian imperial ambition. But for a time, it stood tall, a Nubian kingdom, forged not by foreign will, but by the strength of its own people, its own soil, and its own gods. The river watched, and it remembered. By the dawn of the 16th century BCE, the wind shifted along the Nile. Egypt, newly unified under the powerful kings of the new kingdom, turned its gaze southward, toward the gold-laden lands of Kerma. Kerma, though proud and strong, now faced a rising tide. Pharaohs no longer content with border fortresses sought full dominion over Nubia. And so began one of the most significant periods of imperial expansion in Egyptian history. It was Thutmose I, son of a general and king in his own right, who led the charge. Around 1504 BCE, his army marched deep into Nubian territory, reaching beyond the Fourth Cataract, further south than any pharaoh before him. His stele, carved into the rock, proclaimed Egyptian authority over the land. But these were not the declarations of peace. They marked conquest. The city of Kerma, once a rival power, was overrun. Its temples silenced, its kings dethroned. Egypt claimed not only the territory, but the very soul of Nubia: gold mines, cattle herds, slaves, and sacred sites. Yet, even in defeat, the people did not vanish. Egyptian control of Nubia during the New Kingdom was deep and systematic. Viceroys of Kush, appointed from Thebes, ruled in the name of the pharaoh. They oversaw tax collection, administered justice, and monitored temples. Fortresses lined the Nile, from Buhan in the north to Jebel Barkal in the south. Soldiers, scribes, and artisans arrived in waves, many settling and intermarrying. Egyptian culture flooded Nubia. Hieroglyphs appeared on temple walls. Gods like Amun were worshipped beside local deities. Egyptian-style tombs replaced older burial mounds. And yet, beneath this overlay, something of Kerma remained. Nubians did not become Egyptians. They adapted. They learned the tongue of their conquerors, served in their armies, even became scribes in their courts. But in their villages, in their rituals, in the way they named their children or tended their cattle, they preserved a part of themselves. It was a time of paradox, oppression and opportunity, destruction and rebirth. Nubian nobles, though subordinate, rose in Egyptian society. Some became priests, others generals. Over time, a new generation emerged, Nubians who knew Egypt intimately, but who had not forgotten their own land. This deep entanglement, born of conquest, would bear fruit in generations to come. For the children of the Nile, even those ruled from Thebes, still looked southward, toward their ancestral lands, and waited. The river, patient and undisturbed, remembered it all: the clashing of armies, the burning of temples, the quiet resilience of a people who bowed only outwardly, but never in spirit. And in its flow, there stirred a memory that would one day rise again. Time, like the river, does not stand still. By the 11th century BCE, the strength of Egypt began to falter. The New Kingdom, once proud and imperial, staggered under the weight of internal decay and foreign threat. Its pharaohs grew weaker, its borders shrank, and its distant provinces were left to fend for themselves. And in Nubia, the tide quietly turned. For centuries, the Egyptians had ruled. Their temples stood tall in places like Soleb and Amorra. Their gods were honored, their language taught. But beneath the surface, the old ways had not died. The people of the Nile's southern curve, descendants of Kerma, shaped but not erased by foreign dominion, began to reclaim their own path. As Egypt withdrew, a space opened. And in that space, a new power slowly rose. Its heart lay at Napata, near the sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal, a sandstone pinnacle that the Egyptians themselves had once revered as the southern home of Amun. Now, it became the spiritual and political center of a reborn kingdom, Kush. This was not the Kerma of old, nor merely a remnant of Egypt's imperial outpost. It was something new, a Nubian kingdom that inherited much from its former rulers, but reinterpreted it through its own eyes. The early kings of Kush, whose names are only dimly remembered, Alara, Kashta, established dynasties that asserted control over both Upper Nubia and parts of Lower Nubia. They revived Egyptian religious practices, but with a distinctly Nubian voice. Their temples honored Amun, but their priests were local. Their art followed Egyptian forms, yet bore African features. Their dead were buried in pyramids, smaller than those of Giza, but built with deliberate echo and pride. The people, too, found a new rhythm. Cattle herding remained central. Trade flourished once more, not only with Egypt, but with lands to the south and east. Gold mines were reopened. Craftsmen shaped tools, ornaments, and pottery that blended inherited techniques with revived traditions. In this period, the kingdom of Kush was not merely surviving. It was consolidating. And crucially, its kings began to look north. Egypt, in decline, was fractured between rival priests and princes. The memory of imperial grandeur lingered, but the throne in Thebes was weak. Into this void stepped the kings of Kush, not as invaders, but as restorers. They believed Egypt had lost its sacred order, its divine balance, Ma'at. And they, as heirs of Amun, felt called to restore it. It was a remarkable reversal. The conquered now looked upon the land of the conqueror and saw not a master, but a mission. The Nile flowed steadily through these lands, bearing no judgment. But it had seen the coming of kings, the fall of empires, and now, the quiet rebirth of a people who had once knelt in silence and now stood again. The river remembered. At the foot of the sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal, where the Nile bends gently in its southern arc, a royal house emerged, patient, deliberate, and divinely assured. These were the kings of Napata, the first rulers of a new Kushite age. Their beginning was quiet. No fanfare, no wide-spanning conquests, not yet. The first of them, King Alara, is a figure shrouded in reverence rather than detail. His name survives not in annals of war but in memory, remembered by his descendants as the founder of their sacred line, the one who laid the first stones of what would become a resurgent Nubian kingdom. Alara's power centered on Napata, a city more spiritual than grand, nestled in the desert wind, near Jebel Barkal. The mountain, once hallowed by Egyptians as the southern throne of Amun, now became a Nubian Axis Mundi, a sacred heart of kingship, where divine favor was sought and affirmed. Here, Alara did not build empires. He built legitimacy. He revived temples. He installed priests. He married his daughters into sacred roles, ensuring that kingship and divine service were entwined. His legacy was not just political, it was theological. His rule anchored Kush in a cosmic order that reached back to Amun, the great god of Thebes, and outward through the Nile world. After Alara came Kashta, likely his son, a king whose ambition grew bolder. Kashta did not merely govern Nubia. He turned his gaze to Egypt. In a moment of quiet, Egypt was divided and weak. The high priests of Amun in Thebes held real power, while the nominal pharaohs struggled for authority. Kashta stepped into this space, not as a conqueror, but as a reformer, even a restorer. He sent envoys north. He may have traveled to Thebes himself. What is certain is that he was accepted. His daughter, Amenerdis, was appointed as the god's wife of Amun, a powerful religious office, usually reserved for Egypt's royal elite. With this appointment, Kashta's line gained spiritual sovereignty over southern Egypt. But his was not an Egyptian dynasty. He ruled from Napata, honored his ancestors, and governed as a Kushite. And yet, the door was open, the path to Egypt was no longer barred. Kashta's son would take that step. But for now, under Alara and Kashta, Kush stood poised, grounded in ritual, strengthened by lineage, watching the north not with fear, but with purpose. The river, as always, bore witness. It had seen kings rise from temples and tombs, seen their names etched into stone and washed away by flood. Now it carried southward the echoes of Nubian chants, the quiet clink of gold ingots, and the stirrings of a kingdom that would soon challenge the heirs of Ramses and Akhenaten. Napata had spoken. Its kings had awoken. And the Nile remembered. The time had come. From the sacred city of Napata, where the desert winds carried the incense of Amun's temple, a king set his eyes upon Egypt. His name was Pier, son of Kashta, heir of Alara, and chosen of the god. He would not be content with watching. He would act. Egypt, in the mid-8th century BCE, was a broken land. Fragmented among petty kings and warlords, it had lost the unity and grandeur of old. The Nile Delta was ruled by one prince, the southern city of Thebes by another. Each raised temples, fought neighbors, and claimed divine favor, but none ruled all. Pierre saw in this division a calling. He did not march to conquer. Not in his own mind. He marched to restore, to bring Egypt back into alignment with Maat, the sacred order. His campaign was swift, but not without resistance. Inscriptions carved at Jebel Barkal tell of his march northward, past Thebes, past Memphis, where he faced the armies of Tefnakht, a powerful Delta warlord. Pierre's records, preserved in a great stela, are unlike most royal boasts. He writes not of plunder or glory, but of purification. Before battle, he stopped to bathe and make offerings. He saw his war as a sacred duty. And when he defeated the coalition of Delta rulers, he did not slaughter them. He received their submission with grace, demanding their loyalty and their oaths before Amun. Pierre returned to Napata victorious, but he did not stay in Egypt. He had proven his point, that the kings of Kush, worshippers of Amun, were the rightful rulers of the Nile. From that moment forward, the 25th dynasty of Egypt would be a Nubian dynasty. His successors would hold Egypt more tightly. Shabaka, Pierre's brother, formerly claimed the throne of the two lands and ruled from Memphis. He preserved Egyptian culture, protected temples, and is remembered for commissioning the Memphite Theology, a philosophical treatise that reached back to the most ancient traditions of Egyptian thought. Then came Taharqa, Pierre's son, the greatest of the Black Pharaohs. Taharqa ruled for nearly 30 years and presided over a renaissance. Temples were restored across Egypt and Nubia. Great works of art and architecture flourished. Egypt, for a time, stood unified and strong, its ancient traditions rekindled under the hand of a king from the south. Yet even as he built, threats gathered. To the northeast, a new power was rising, the Assyrian Empire. Iron-armed and ruthless, they swept through the Levant and soon looked toward Egypt. Taharqa fought them, more than once. At times victorious, at times driven back, he defended the Nile Valley against the eastern tide. But time wore down the Kushite hold. After Taharqa, his nephew Tantamani tried to reclaim lost ground, but Memphis fell. The Assyrians stormed Thebes. The Nubians were pushed back to Napata. And yet, their legacy endured. Though their reign over Egypt ended, the Kushite kings had done what few others could: they had restored the Nile. For nearly a century, the rulers of the 25th dynasty brought stability, reverence, and unity to a fractured land. They ruled not as foreigners, but as stewards of a sacred tradition, one they had adopted, preserved, and, in many ways, elevated. In Egypt, their monuments were later defaced, their names erased, but not forgotten. In Nubia, their memory remained intact. They were not just kings. They were the embodiment of a civilization's rise, and its capacity to lead with wisdom, dignity, and strength. The river, steady and ancient, flowed through Napata and Memphis alike. It remembered the chants of coronations, the prayers of queens, the hoofbeats of Assyrian horses, and the silence that followed. It remembered the time when the kings of Kush had ruled the two lands. And it carried their legacy forward. After the storm of empire, the river turned quiet once more. Egypt, though still restless under foreign hands, no longer called to the kings of Kush. Their gaze shifted southward, deeper into the lands they had always called home. And so, the heart of the Kushite kingdom moved. From Napata, sacred and windswept, the capital shifted to Meroe, a city nestled between the 5th and 6th cataracts, where the river ran narrower, and the land was rich with forests and iron-bearing hills. This was no retreat, but a renewal. The move likely began in the late 7th century BCE, under kings who saw both danger in the north and opportunity in the south. Napata remained holy, the site of coronations, the home of Amun's oracle. But Meroe became the seat of power, administration, and life. It was a place less vulnerable to foreign invasion, more rooted in Nubian soil, and perfectly placed for trade between Central Africa, the Red Sea, and the Mediterranean world. Here, Kush transformed. The city of Meroe grew into a metropolis of stone palaces, grand temples, and towering pyramids. Its streets echoed with the clang of metal, for this was now a kingdom of iron. Blacksmiths and artisans worked tirelessly, feeding a local economy that no longer depended on Egypt's patterns but followed its own. The forests nearby provided charcoal. The mines offered iron ore and gold. Craftsmen made weapons, tools, and ornaments. Pottery evolved in new forms, painted with motifs that blended ancient Egyptian images with clearly African symbols: lions, giraffes, serpents, and sun discs glowing in isolation. But perhaps the most telling transformation came in language. Around this time, the Meroitic script emerged, a writing system distinct from Egyptian hieroglyphs. It appeared on temple walls, stelae, and tombs. Though not yet fully deciphered, this script marked a clear assertion: Kush had become its own world, literate and expressive in its own voice. Religion, too, adapted. Amun remained a central figure, but other deities, such as Apedemak, a lion-headed god of war and fertility, gained prominence, unknown in Egypt, but powerful in Meroe. This blending of traditions, Egyptian, local, and entirely new, gave the culture of Meroe a character unlike anything before. The royal family, still descended from the Napatan line, took on new roles. Queens, now more than ever, held power. Some ruled alone as kandates, warrior queens, regents, or co-rulers whose strength was more than ceremonial. Their names appear in inscriptions, their images carved into stone, standing proud, bow in hand, crown upon brow. From Mero, the kingdom of Kush thrived for centuries. It conducted diplomacy, fought wars, governed provinces, and nurtured a distinctive civilization that would endure long after other empires had fallen to dust. The Nile, narrower here, ran swift through the land of Mero. It saw not decline, but transformation. It no longer carried the weight of Egyptian imperial dreams, it now bore the pulse of an African kingdom fully reborn, master of its destiny, proud in its independence. And as the wind stirred the tall grasses of the savannah, the river remembered. In the quiet hours before dawn, the city of Mero stirred, not with the chants of priests or the tread of foreign armies, but with the hum of daily life. Traders opened their stalls, smiths lit their forges, scribes prepared tablets, and queens held court. This was no shadow of Egypt. It was a civilization in full bloom. The Meroitic period, stretching from roughly the 3rd century BCE to the 4th century CE, marked the high point of the Kushite kingdom's cultural flowering. In these centuries, Mero stood not only as a political capital, but as a symbol of a fully matured, African power. At its core was writing. The Meroitic script, both cursive and hieroglyphic in form, was used for inscriptions, royal decrees, and religious dedications. Though modern scholars have yet to fully unlock its meanings, its presence across temples and tombs testifies to a literate culture with its own narrative voice. These were not borrowed words. They were Kushite words, shaped by their own tongue, their own thoughts. Religion, too, evolved. Temples still rose to honor Amun, but new gods walked beside him. Chief among them was Apedemak, the lion-headed deity who stood for war, fertility, and royal might. His images, carved into sandstone walls, showed him spearing enemies, blessing kings, and guarding the land. Unlike Egypt's distant and aloof pantheon, Apedemak felt rooted in Mero's soil, a god of strength born from the African heartland. Women held sacred roles. The kandates, queens, and queen mothers, often governed alongside kings or in their place. Some led armies. Others managed temples and oversaw trade. In sculpture and inscription, they appear as figures of authority, their names etched into memory, their presence unquestioned. And then there was the economy, tireless, intricate, and broad. Mero was a kingdom of iron. Its forges produced weapons, tools, and ornaments. Charcoal from nearby forests fueled production. Iron goods traveled down the Nile and across desert routes, reaching markets in Egypt, Arabia, and beyond. Gold, too, remained plentiful. Ivory, incense, hides, and exotic animals passed through its borders. Trade linked Mero to the wider world, to Ptolemaic and Roman Egypt, to Arabia Felix, to Axum across the Red Sea, and possibly even to India through merchant intermediaries. But these connections did not dilute Meroitic identity. Rather, they affirmed it, a kingdom strong enough to deal with great powers, yet sovereign in its customs. Architecture in Meroe reflected its uniqueness. Temples stood on raised platforms with step designs. The royal cemetery, just east of the city, held over 200 pyramids, smaller than their Egyptian cousins, but slender and steep, marked with chapels and inscriptions that honored the dead. Each tomb told a story of kings who ruled wisely, of queens who defended the realm, of warriors, priests, and artisans whose names may be forgotten, but whose stones endure. The Nile flowed still, curling past the city's edge. Its waters fed crops, moved goods, and mirrored the stars at night. But now, it bore the reflections of a civilization that had claimed its own destiny, not as an echo of others, but as a voice singular and proud. The river remembered. It had carried the dreams of Kerma, the prayers of Napata, and now the iron song of Meroe. And it flowed on. No kingdom endures forever. Even the strongest cities, the richest lands, the proudest dynasties, all must one day yield to time, to change, and to the weight of history. So it was with Kush. By the 3rd century CE, the great kingdom of Meroe began to falter. Not all at once, and not from a single blow, but gradually, like a flame flickering low before it fades. The signs were many. First came climate. The once fertile plains near Meroe began to dry. Centuries of deforestation, to fuel the iron forges that had once brought wealth, left the land bare. Without trees, the soil weakened. Rains grew scarce. The Nile's floods, once predictable, grew erratic. Agriculture, the foundation of daily life, began to suffer. Then came rebellion. In the southern provinces, far from Meroe's gaze, local leaders rose with ambitions of their own. The king's grasp grew weaker. Some regions broke away entirely. In the north, ancient ties with Egypt were long severed. Roman rule had come and gone, leaving little trace beyond the frontier. The world had changed, and Meroe stood increasingly alone. But the final blow would come not from within, but from the highlands to the southeast. From the kingdom of Aksum. Aksum, rising in what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea, was a new and hungry power. With ports on the Red Sea and alliances in Arabia, it commanded trade routes that once passed through Kush. It minted coins, built stone obelisks, and spoke in the confident voice of empire. Tension simmered. Then, sometime in the 4th century CE, Aksum struck. Their king, perhaps Ezana, the first Christian monarch of Aksum, launched a campaign against Meroe. Inscriptions in Ge'ez and Greek speak of war and conquest. Cities were burned. Temples defiled. The old capital, already weakened, could not stand. Meroe fell. The royal line, after 1,000 years of kingship, faded into silence. And yet, Kush did not vanish. Its memory endured, in broken stones, in half-buried pyramids, in the language of the people who remained. Even the Aksumites, in their triumph, acknowledged the dignity of their foes. They did not erase Kush, they succeeded it. For centuries more, in places like Nabatea, Mercuria, and Alodia, the torch would pass, not a resurrection, but a rebirth. Still, something had ended. The sound of the forges ceased. The palaces fell to ruin. The temples stood open to sky and sand. And the Nile, faithful witness, flowed past the city that had once ruled 1,000 miles of river. It carried no judgment, only memory. For it remembered the rise and glory of Meroe, and now it bore witness to its stillness. The fall of Meroe was not the end. Though the great city had quieted, though its pyramids stood windworn and its forges cold, the peoples of the Nile did not disappear. From the ruins, from the hills and valleys of northern Nubia, new kingdoms rose, smaller in reach, but no less proud. Their names were Nubia, Mercuria, and Alodia. These were not mere remnants of Kush. They were heirs, political, cultural, and spiritual, to its legacy. And though they emerged in a changing world, they carried forward the deep traditions of Nubian kingship, riverine life, and sacred rule. The northernmost of the three was Nubia. Established sometime in the late 4th century CE, Nubia arose in the land between the First and Second Cataracts, a region long contested between Egypt and Nubia. After the fall of Meroe, this frontier zone became a refuge for those seeking stability, identity, and order. Nubia was not born in isolation. It inherited the structures of Meroitic culture, its burial customs, its language, even its royal practices. But it also looked northward. The Roman Empire, now Christian and waning, still cast a faint shadow across the Mediterranean world. Nubia absorbed elements of this new faith. By the mid-6th century, it would become the first of the Nubian kingdoms to adopt Christianity, a change that would shape its future. To the south of Nubia lay Mercuria, destined to become the most powerful of the three. Its early years are less clearly known, but by the 6th century, Mercuria had established itself as a strong kingdom, with its capital at Old Dongola, a fortified city rising from the desert, overlooking the Nile. Mercuria inherited not only the territory, but the spirit of Meroe, a commitment to kingship, a reverence for divine order, and a will to stand firm against foreign encroachment. Further south still, in the fertile heartland of the Blue and White Niles, rose Alodia, sometimes called Alwa. Of the three, Alodia occupied the most distant and least understood corner of the old Kushite world. Yet it, too, held fast to the memory of Meroe, even as it developed a distinct cultural rhythm, rooted in its unique geography and trade networks. Together, these three kingdoms carried Nubia into the Christian era. Their rulers built churches instead of temples, painted icons instead of carving gods, and read from holy texts rather than royal stele. But beneath the Christian veneer lay deep continuity, in language, in social customs, in architecture, and in the enduring rhythm of life along the Nile. The old world had ended. A new one had begun. But the river remained. It flowed past the ghost of Meroe and the walls of Dongola. It passed the tombs of ancient kings and the domes of Christian cathedrals. It whispered the same truth it had always carried, that civilizations rise, fall, and rise again, and that memory, carried on water, never truly dies. In the stillness that followed Meroe's fall, the northern frontier of Nubia did not remain empty for long. There, where the Nile slices between rocks and desert hills, a new power emerged, cautious, deliberate, but resilient. This was Nubia. Born around the early 5th century CE, Nubia took shape in a land long contested, between fading Roman garrisons and restless desert tribes, between the echo of old gods and the distant call of new faiths. It occupied the stretch of the Nile from the first cataract to Aswan down to the second, centering on places like Foras, Khaza Ibrim, and Balana. The early Nubian kings did not rule from palaces, but from fortresses. Their realm was born in defense against the Blemmyes, nomadic raiders from the eastern deserts who harassed river settlements and claimed territories on both sides of the Nile. To meet this threat, the people of Nubia rallied under a warrior king whose name would be carved in stone, Silko. Silko was not only a commander, he was a founder. In an inscription left at Kalabsha, written in Greek, he declared himself king of the Nobati and all the Ethiopians, and described his victories over the Blemmyes. That he chose to write in Greek shows the lingering influence of the Mediterranean world. Even as Rome faded, its cultural shadow remained. Silko's rule marks a turning point. Under his leadership, Nubia consolidated its territory, pushed back the desert raiders, and established a stable kingship. It also began a slow transformation, one that would shape the next chapter of Nubian history. For it was during Silko's time that Christianity first entered the Nile Valley. The gospel did not come through fire and sword, but through word and ritual. Missionaries traveled south from Egypt, some Coptic, some Byzantine, bearing texts, icons, and prayers. They found in Nubia a people open to new forms of sacredness, even as they remembered the old. By the year 543 CE, Nubia officially embraced Christianity, a moment that would define its identity for centuries. Pagan temples were converted or abandoned. Crosses replaced solar discs. And bishops, not just warriors, began to shape the land's destiny. This conversion, while religious in form, was also political. It linked Nubia with the broader Christian world, especially with Byzantine Egypt, which saw in Nubia both an ally and a spiritual frontier. It also gave the kings of Nubia new authority, sanctified not only by lineage, but by divine order. But even in conversion, Nubia did not forget itself. Its rulers continued to bury their dead with care, in tombs carved beneath mounds, with goods that mingled old rites and new beliefs. Its art began to blend Nubian forms with Christian symbols. Its people worshipped the Trinity, but in languages shaped by the desert wind. The kingdom had been born from war, but it grew in faith. And the river, flowing past Foras and Kalabsha, remembered the clamor of Blemmyes, the prayers of monks, and the silent strength of a people reclaiming their place in history. It bore Nubia forward, toward peace, toward unity, and toward the long twilight of ancient Africa's last Christian kingdoms. The land between Egypt and Inner Nubia had never known lasting peace. It was a borderland, a place of shifting sands, fractured loyalties, and endless movement. And into this uncertain world stepped a man who would forge order from chaos, King Silko of Nubia. Silko was more than a ruler. He was a commander of men, a founder of states, and the first Nubian king whose name speaks clearly across the centuries. His deeds are not merely whispered in legend, they are carved in stone. The greatest of these inscriptions stands at Calabsha, in the shadow of a once grand temple. There, in the Greek tongue, a language of empire and diplomacy, Silko proclaims himself Basileus of the Nobati and all the Ethiopians. He recounts how he defeated the Blemmyes, desert raiders who had long troubled the frontier. The Blemmyes were no mere bandits. They were a proud and nomadic people, descended from ancient desert tribes, skilled in swift attack and elusive retreat. For generations they had challenged Egyptian and Roman authority, plundering villages, disrupting trade, and carving out zones of control in the eastern desert. To the settled people of the Nile, farmers, craftsmen, priests, the Blemmyes were a constant threat. Silko met them with force. We know little of the exact battles, their dates, their locations. But the outcome is clear. Silko pushed the Blemmyes eastward, out of the Nile Valley. He secured Nabatia's borders, established fortresses along key crossings, and reclaimed territory long held in doubt. But his war was more than a campaign. It was a declaration that Nabatia was not a client of Rome, nor a mere echo of Mero, but a sovereign power with a will to endure. In Silko's time, Nabatia became a kingdom of stone and script. Fortified towns like Khaza Ibrim rose above the river banks. Watchtowers stood over caravan roads. New forms of governance took shape. And the fusion of traditions, Meroitic, Egyptian, Roman, began to settle into something distinctly Nabatian. Silko also built relationships beyond the sword. His use of Greek in inscriptions suggests contact with Egypt's elite, perhaps even with the remnants of Roman administration. Through such ties, Christianity flowed southward, not yet a torrent, but a trickle, a cross carved here, a bishop's name remembered there. It would be Silko's successors who embraced the new faith fully. But he prepared the way, by giving Nabatia peace, purpose, and pride. As the king's armies withdrew from the eastern frontier, leaving silence where once there had been conflict, the Nile resumed its quiet path. It flowed past temples repurposed as churches, past tombs holding warriors and nobles, past villages no longer afraid. It remembered Silko's triumph, not in the clangor of battle, but in the stillness that followed. For the river understood that order, once restored, is the foundation of all things that last. With the Blemmyes driven back and the frontier secure, Nabatia began to turn inward, not in retreat, but in consolidation. It was time to build. The foundations of governance in Nabatia were a blend of the old and the new. The king stood at the summit, not only a military leader, but a sacred figure, the center of law and divine favor. Below him, local governors and nobles administered key regions, often based in fortified towns such as Foras, Khaza Ibrim, and Balana. These towns, once sleepy river settlements or outposts of Roman and Egyptian power, now thrived under Nabatian rule. Their walls rose higher, their streets widened, their temples, whether pagan or Christian, began to take on fresh meaning. Markets echoed with voices in many tongues, Nubian, Coptic, Greek, perhaps still Meroitic. Trade continued, modest but steady, grain, cloth, salt, incense, livestock. The culture of Nabatia retained echoes of Meroitic traditions. Artisans carved amulets and pottery in forms familiar from the time of Mero. Burials remained elaborate. At Bolana and Kustal, tombs were found rich with goods, bronze bowls, weapons, jewelry, and even sacrificed animals, signs of a culture still honoring its elite in death as it did in life. Yet these tombs also marked a transition. No longer were the symbols purely Meroitic or Egyptian. The crowns, the swords, the thrones, they showed local innovation. Nubia was not imitating. It was becoming. In religion, the kingdom stood on the threshold of change. For centuries, the gods of Egypt and Kush had ruled the sacred landscape, Amun, Isis, Osiris, and the lion god Apidamak. Their temples still stood in stone, some kept alive with quiet rituals. But around these ancient sanctuaries, new voices began to rise: Christian monks, foreign missionaries, and local converts. Christianity came gently at first. It was not imposed. It was received. Crosses were etched into temple walls, as if to bless what had come before. Small chapels were built near older shrines. The people of Nubia did not abandon their past. They brought it with them, shaping a faith that would be both Christian and distinctly Nubian. There is no evidence of religious persecution in this period. The transformation was gradual, a weaving together rather than a severing. And in this tapestry, Nubia found a new identity. The kingdom became a land of transition, between Meroitic memory and Christian future, between tribal customs and royal governance, between desert solitude and riverine community. It did not boast empires or vast conquests. But it endured. It governed. It believed. And always, beneath it all, flowed the Nile. It watched as priests offered sacrifices, then later lit candles before icons. It bore the cries of infants baptized in its waters, and the silence of kings entombed beside its banks. It remembered the names, the prayers, the labors of a people forging something steady in a world of shifting sands. Nubia had found its rhythm. The year was 543 CE. A quiet revolution swept through the Nile Valley, not by force, but by faith. That year, under the reign of a Nubian king whose name is lost to time, the kingdom officially embraced Christianity, and with it, a new vision of life, kingship, and the sacred. The mission came from the north. Egypt, now ruled by Byzantium, was a Christian land. The old temples of Isis at Philae had been shuttered. Monks had settled along the Nile, building whitewashed chapels, planting groves, and copying sacred texts. From this world came a man named Julian, a Coptic bishop sent by the Patriarch of Alexandria, with the blessing of Emperor Justinian himself. Julian did not come alone. He traveled with priests, interpreters, and artisans. He carried crosses and books. And he brought a message not of conquest, but of salvation. Nubia received him. What passed between the bishop and the king is not recorded. No treaty, no decree survives. But what followed is unmistakable. Churches began to rise across the land, simple structures at first, made of mud brick or stone, but adorned with painted frescoes and wooden crosses. The temple at Foras, once a shrine to the gods of Egypt, became a cathedral. Its walls would later be covered with vivid murals, saints, angels, apostles, and kings of Nubatia, robed and crowned, standing humbly before the Virgin Mary. These paintings, preserved centuries later beneath layers of sand, speak of a world transformed not by war, but by art, ritual, and belief. With the cross came new rhythms. Baptism replaced older rites of initiation. Liturgy and scripture in the Coptic language entered the land, though Nubian speech continued in daily life. Bishops took their place beside nobles. Monasteries dotted the desert, places of learning, healing, and prayer. The transformation was not only spiritual. It redefined the very structure of Nubatian rule. The king, once divine in the tradition of Mero, now stood as God's servant, ruling by grace rather than descent. His legitimacy flowed not just from lineage, but from alignment with the Church. Religion and state became interwoven, each supporting the other. Yet in all this, Nubatia did not forget itself. Christianity in the kingdom bore a distinctly Nubian face. Saints were painted with dark skin, local garments, and royal insignia. Churches incorporated local building styles. The desert remained sacred, not as a place of exile, but as a dwelling for holy men. And the old gods, though silent, were not desecrated. They were quietly laid to rest, their temples left in peace or gently repurposed. The new faith came not to destroy, but to fulfill. By mid-century, Nubatia stood as a Christian kingdom, the first in Nubia. It would not be the last. The river bore witness. It carried the songs of monks as they rode from village to village. It mirrored the light of candles flickering inside domed chapels. It remembered the incense, the processions, the soft chant of prayers rising toward the stars. In Nubatia, the Nile had seen many gods. Now, it bore the cross. With the kingdom of Nubatia firmly embracing Christianity, a new landscape began to rise along the Nile, one not marked by temples of stone lions or pyramids of kings, but by churches, icons, and the quiet authority of the Christian elite. Nowhere was this transformation more visible than at Foras, the kingdom's spiritual heart. Perched on a rise above the river, Foras had once been a place of pagan worship. Now, it became the seat of a bishopric, its cathedral the finest in all Nubia. Built in the mid-6th century and rebuilt several times, the Cathedral of Foras was a large, rectangular church of stone and mud brick, its walls coated in thick plaster, its ceilings supported by wooden beams and painted with sacred scenes. Inside, light filtered through narrow windows, casting long shadows across the frescoed walls. Angels stood with outstretched wings. The Virgin Mary, solemn and serene, watched over the faithful. Apostles, saints, and martyrs filled the space, not abstract symbols, but figures rooted in the life of the land, painted with Nubian features, clothed in local dress, adorned with jewelry known to the people. In one mural, a Nubian bishop stands in white robes, his hand raised in blessing. In another, an Nubatian king kneels, presenting a church as an offering to Christ. This was not merely art. It was theology made visible, a statement that heaven had entered the land, and that Nubatia stood beneath its gaze. These churches were not limited to Foras. Across Nubia, small chapels and monasteries appeared, often near ancient temples or in the solitude of the desert. Built from local materials, they followed the architectural traditions of Egypt and Byzantium, but always with adaptations. Thick walls, narrow windows, flat roofs, they were made to withstand the desert winds and the rhythms of the Nile. Within them, the Christian elite came into being. The clergy, bishops, priests, deacons, formed a new class, educated in Coptic scripture, trained in liturgy, and often closely tied to the royal court. Many came from noble families. Others were former soldiers or officials. Together, they oversaw the spiritual and moral life of the kingdom. They preached, judged disputes, recorded baptisms and marriages, and preserved texts, written now in Greek, Coptic, and eventually, the first forms of Old Nubian. These texts included Gospels, Psalters, theological treatises, and letters, signs of a literate and literate society where faith and governance were deeply intertwined. The kings, for their part, became defenders of the church. They patronized building projects, funded monasteries, and ensured that bishops were appointed with dignity. In return, they were painted into church walls and remembered in prayers. Their crowns bore crosses. Their thrones sat beside altars. Their power was sanctified. This fusion of royal and spiritual authority gave Nubia a rare stability. Though small, the kingdom was cohesive, united by faith, governed with sacred legitimacy, and held together by a noble class that saw itself as stewards of a Christian land. Outside its borders, other kingdoms still lingered in older ways. But within Nubia, a new world had fully taken root. And the Nile, flowing past cathedrals and cloisters, carried this story downstream. It had seen temples of stone gods, the fires of war, the prayers of priests, and now the quiet work of scribes, the soft hum of liturgy, and the sound of bells rising over the water. In Nubia, the stones had begun to speak of Christ. By the dawn of the 7th century, the map of Christian Nubia was changing once more. Nubia, strong and devout, had entered a new chapter, one shaped not by conquest or collapse, but by quiet transition. To its south lay the rising kingdom of Mercuria. Mercuria had emerged in the mid-6th century, a generation after Nubia's conversion. Its capital at Old Dongola rose on a bend in the Nile, fortified by thick walls and crowned with a royal palace. Like Nubia, Mercuria had adopted Christianity, and like Nubia, it had embraced the bishopric of Alexandria and the Coptic rite. But Mercuria was different in scale. It commanded a larger territory, with stronger trade links to Alodia and the interior lands beyond. Its court was more centralized, its army better organized. As Nubia's rulers looked southward, they saw not a rival, but a mirror, one that might offer strength, stability, and unity in a time of change. The transition began not with blood, but with alliance. The two kingdoms, both Christian, both governed by kings with ties to the church, found common cause in defending their faith and lands. The great threat was no longer the Blemmyes or desert raiders, but the shifting winds of Arabia and Egypt. For in 641 CE, Egypt fell to the armies of Islam. The Byzantine garrisons vanished. The old order collapsed. Nubia, smaller and closer to the new frontier, felt vulnerable. Mercuria, with its deeper reserves and stronger military, was better positioned to respond. By the mid-7th century, the two kingdoms were in close communion. Bishops moved freely between Foras and Dongola. Monasteries in both regions spoke the same prayers. Kings exchanged gifts. And at some point, though the exact year is lost, Nubatia was peacefully absorbed into Mercuria. This was not a conquest, nor a collapse. It was a union. Mercuria inherited Nubatia's territories, towns, and traditions. The cathedral at Foras remained a center of faith. Nubatian nobles likely continued to serve as governors and priests. But the banner under which they served now bore the name of Mercuria. The Mercurian kings became the defenders of all northern Nubia. This transition strengthened both lands. It allowed for a unified response to the new Islamic caliphates in Egypt. It brought consistency to trade, to governance, and to faith. And it laid the foundation for what would become a Nubian golden age, centered in Mercuria, but deeply rooted in Nubatia's legacy. And what of the people? They remained. The farmers still tilled the soil. The merchants still traded in ivory and gold. The monks still prayed. Their world had changed, but slowly, and with continuity. The kingdom they now served had a new name, but its heart remained familiar. And the Nile flowed on. It passed the cathedrals and fields of a land that had chosen unity over pride, faith over fear. It bore the echoes of two kingdoms, now one, joined not by war, but by wisdom. And in that union, the river saw a future, for Mercuria, and for Christian Nubia. In the quiet years after the Arab conquest of Egypt, as new powers settled in the north and the old Byzantine roads fell silent, Nubia stood apart, a land still ruled by Christian kings, still shaped by the river, still guided by the cross. And along that river, the kingdoms of Nubatia and Mercuria became one. The merger, which likely occurred in the latter half of the 7th century, was not a clash of armies, but a gentle folding of one kingdom into another. Nubatia, long faithful and established, entered the broader political structure of Mercuria, a rising state whose influence now stretched from the First Cataract to the very borders of Alodia. The result was a unified Christian Nubian kingdom, governed from the capital at Old Dongola. This new Mercuria was more than the sum of its parts. It inherited Nubatia's northern fortresses, its elite families, its sacred centers like Foras and Khaza Ibrim. Its rulers now commanded both Upper and Lower Nubia, from the deserts near Aswan to the green valleys beyond Dongola. The integration brought not only land, but legitimacy. The union of two Christian kingdoms strengthened their standing in the eyes of Egypt, Byzantium, and the Church in Alexandria. Culturally, the blending was smooth. Both kingdoms shared the Coptic rite, the Alexandrian Patriarchate, and the memory of Meroitic traditions. Both revered the Bishop of Foras, who continued to serve under Mercurian kings. Both celebrated saints' days, fasted through Lent, and rang the same bells at morning prayers. But the merger also deepened the development of a distinctly Nubian identity. Far from the influence of Egypt, and removed from the great cities of Byzantium, the Christian culture of Mercuria, now joined with Nubatia, took on new expressions. Churches combined Byzantine design with local materials and symbolism. Royal art depicted kings not as distant emperors, but as shepherds of the people, clothed in Nubian robes, crowned with crosses. The language evolved too. Greek and Coptic remained in scripture and formal texts, but the everyday speech of the court and clergy began to appear in Old Nubian, written in an adapted Coptic script, one of Africa's earliest Christian vernaculars. In governance, the union brought efficiency. Former Nabatian governors likely became officials under the Mercurian crown. Local nobles retained their lands, but pledged loyalty to Dongola. Bishops in the north served alongside their southern brethren. And royal messengers, traveling by river or desert, carried laws, letters, and blessings from king to clergy across a kingdom nearly 1,000 kilometers long. This unity would prove vital in the years to come. When Arab forces pressed south from Egypt, they met not scattered villages, but a united Christian realm, strong, organized, and fortified. The Back Treaty, signed soon after, preserved Nubia's independence for centuries, in no small part due to the strength provided by the Nabatea-Mercuria Union. And the Nile, winding through all of it, bore the signs of new harmony. Church towers replaced temple pylons. Painted saints gazed out from walls where once gods had been carved. The people prayed in the language of Christ, but tilled their fields and buried their dead as they always had. Two kingdoms had become one. And the river remembered the old borders, the old names, and carried them gently into the stream of a shared future. Though the crown now rested in Old Dongola, the spirit of Nabatea was not extinguished. It lived on, in custom, in structure, in the silent strength of its people. The merger into Mercuria had ended its political independence, but not its identity. In many ways, Nabatea became the northern arm of Mercuria, its gateway to Egypt, its shield against the desert, its first line of contact with the outside world. The great towns of Foras, Khaza Ibrim, and Kalabsha remained important centers of administration and faith. Nabatian nobles continued to serve as governors and priests, their family lines woven into the Mercurian elite. In this unified kingdom, there was no need to erase the past. The legacy of Nabatea enriched Mercuria. Its artistic tradition, already flourishing in Foras, became part of a broader Mercurian aesthetic. The churches of Nabatea, painted with vibrant saints and crowned kings, influenced those further south. The visual language of Christian Nubia, dark-skinned angels, Nubian bishops in white robes, kings standing beside Mary, found its earliest and purest expressions in Nabatian chapels. These images did more than decorate walls. They reflected a theological vision, that Nubia was not on the margins of the Christian world, but at its heart, that its people, its kings, its priests, were fully part of God's kingdom. Nabatea also contributed to the structure of the church. Its bishopric, seated at Foras, remained one of the most prominent in the land. The Eparch of Nabatea, as he came to be called, was responsible not only for the local clergy but often acted as a liaison between Mercuria and the Alexandrian Patriarch. In times of political tension, the bishops of Foras were known to advise kings, negotiate treaties, and settle disputes. In language, too, Nabatea left its mark. Old Nubian, written in Coptic script with added letters from Meroitic and Greek, likely developed in part through scribes in Nabatia's churches and schools. Its emergence signaled a cultural shift, a move away from foreign tongues toward a language that reflected the Nubian soul. Even the funerary practices of Nabatia endured. Though overtly Christian, burials still followed ancient rhythms, bodies placed on beds, surrounded by pottery and goods, beneath mounds that echoed earlier Nubian traditions. The dead were not forgotten, they were honored, in life and after, as part of a continuum that stretched back to Meroe and beyond. And among the people, the farmers, the potters, the fishermen, daily life flowed on. They lived in villages of mud brick and thatch, planted fields by the river, raised children under the watchful eyes of saints and ancestors alike. The king might rule from Dongola, but the heartbeat of the land still pulsed through the old Nabatian soil. In this quiet endurance, Nabatia's legacy was secure. It had not fallen. It had become. And the Nile, winding past its ruins and cathedrals, remembered the kingdom that had once stood alone, and now stood, ever still, within the shelter of a greater whole. Where words fade, images remain. In the stone chapels and crumbling cathedrals of old Nabatia, the story of a people, their faith, their pride, their transformation, survives not in chronicles or epics, but in color and line, in paint and plaster, in the gaze of saints, in the bowed heads of kings. This is the world of Nabatian art. Nowhere is it more vivid than in the cathedral at Foras, a church that, for centuries, stood as the heart of the northern kingdom. There, under layers of silt and silence, archaeologists uncovered a gallery of frescoes that remain among the greatest treasures of Christian Africa. The walls were covered, floor to ceiling, with fresco paintings in bold earth tones, depicting sacred scenes and holy figures. Saints in long robes stood beneath arches. Angels, feathered and watchful, extended their wings. The Virgin Mary, regal and serene, held the infant Christ. Apostles gathered in rows, each with a distinct expression and gesture. But it is not only the heavenly that speaks here. It is the earthly, the distinctly Nubian. Kings and queens appear side by side with the saints. Their skin is dark, their faces round and noble. They wear local garments, tunics, sashes, golden jewelry. One king holds a miniature church in his hands, offering it to Christ in humility. Another kneels beneath an archangel's wings, seeking protection. These are not generic figures. They are specific rulers, kings of Nabatia, remembered and honored within sacred space. This blending of royal and divine imagery reveals the theology of rule in Nabatia, that kingship was not merely a matter of inheritance or power, but a calling, a sacred trust given by God. And so the king did not merely rule the land. He stood as a bridge between heaven and earth. The style of Nabatian art reflects many traditions. From Byzantium came the forms, elongated bodies, solemn eyes, halos of light. From Egypt came the use of Coptic iconography and narrative scenes. But from Nubia itself came the colors, the faces, and the context. The art of Nabatia is neither imitation nor isolation. It is a fusion, uniquely its own. Alongside the paintings, inscriptions were carved and painted, mostly in Greek, occasionally in Coptic, and eventually in Old Nubian. They record names, dedications, prayers. They tell us of bishops, kings, donors. They speak of gifts made to churches, of saints remembered, of sins forgiven. One such inscription might read, "For the salvation of his soul, King Mercurius gave this chapel to St. George." Another might mark the consecration of a bishop or the blessing of a noble family. Though brief, these texts personalize the sacred. They place Nubia not in abstraction, but in human memory, in choices made, offerings given, faith expressed. Beyond the cathedrals, crosses were etched into the walls of houses, into city gates, into stones placed along the roadside. These were not grand gestures, but quiet affirmations that the land was blessed, that God walked beside the people, that every village and dwelling could be part of the divine. Through art and inscription, Nubia told its story. A story of survival and sanctity. Of pride in its heritage. Of full participation in the Christian world, not as subjects, but as creators, patrons, and believers. The Nile, gliding past Foras and Casa Ibram, once mirrored the images painted on plastered walls. It caught the reds, the ochres, the blues. It reflected saints and kings alike, bathed in early morning light. And it remembered. By the 8th century, Nubia, once a kingdom in its own right, had faded into the fabric of a larger realm. It no longer minted its own kings or sent out its own envoys. Its name, once carved in stone by Silko and spoken in the courts of Foras, began to soften, to blend into the voice of Mercuria. But it was not forgotten. In the churches and monasteries that dotted its hills and river banks, the memory of Nubia lived on, not as a separate power, but as a foundational layer of Nubia's Christian identity. Its cities, Foras, Casa Ibram, and Bolana, remained vital nodes of spiritual and cultural life. Bishops continued to be appointed at Foras, even as Mercuria rose in strength. The Eparch of Nubia, though now subordinate to the Mercurian court, retained significant influence in the northern regions. The traditions of Nubian worship, its liturgical practices, its saints' feasts, its architectural forms, endured. Yet time moved forward, and pressures grew. To the north, the Arab rulers of Egypt, now firmly established under successive Islamic dynasties, cast long shadows. Though the Back Treaty had secured peace, trade, and diplomatic ties between Egypt and Christian Nubia, relations were never easy. Tensions flared at times, especially in border towns. Foras and Casa Ibram, once flourishing centers, began to face isolation. The routes that once connected them to Egypt and the Mediterranean grew thinner. The Christian world they once belonged to, Byzantium, Alexandria, the monasteries of the Eastern Church, shrank under the advance of Islam. Still, Nubia held fast. Even in decline, it did not fall in rebellion or fire. It aged with dignity. Its churches remained in use, often for centuries. Its tombs were still honored. Its people continued their rhythms, planting, fishing, praying, raising children who would speak the same soft dialects and sing the same old hymns. And so, the end was not sharp, but quiet. By the late medieval period, Nubia no longer appears in records as a separate region. Its cities, if mentioned at all, are spoken of as Mercurian provinces, or later as territories under the influence of the shifting powers that followed. Its name passed out of formal use, surviving only in fragments, in the memory of monks, in the words of travelers, and in the silent stones. Centuries later, when the cathedral at Foras was excavated, when its paintings were lifted from the walls and placed in museums, the voices of Nubia spoke again, not in conquest, not in decree, but in color, prayer, and brushstroke. The Nile bore those voices. It had carried the sounds of warriors and bishops, kings and potters, chants and bells. It had flowed through Nubia's rise and through its fading. And in its waters, something of the kingdom still moved, not seen, perhaps, but remembered. A kingdom that once rose alone, then stood as part of something greater. A kingdom that built with stone, ruled with grace, and painted its prayers where the light could touch them. In the silence left by the old gods, and in the shadows of forgotten pyramids, a new kingdom rose, slow as the flood, certain as the sun. Its name was Mercuria. Born sometime in the 5th century CE, Mercuria emerged in the heart of Nubia, between the 3rd and 5th cataracts of the Nile. Its land stretched across wide floodplains and desert plateaus, anchored by the river, guarded by cliffs. This was not the desert edge of Egypt nor the deep savanna of Alodia, it was the middle kingdom of Christian Nubia. At its center stood old Dongola. Once a small riverside settlement, Dongola rose to prominence as Mercuria's capital. It was chosen not only for its position, well placed for defense, trade, and agriculture, but also for its sacred geography. Here, the Nile narrowed. The land offered space for temples, palaces, and walls. And so the city grew, a place of courts and cathedrals, of markets and monasteries. Mercuria did not appear in an instant. It evolved. Its early rulers were likely local nobles, chiefs who united river communities under shared language, law, and faith. The memory of Mero lingered, in burial customs, in local symbols, but the identity of Mercuria was new, Christian, and firmly African. By the 6th century, Mercuria had embraced Christianity, following Nubia's path. Its kings aligned with the Coptic Church in Alexandria, receiving bishops, building churches, and promoting monastic life. The royal court welcomed scribes, painters, and priests, many trained in Coptic and Greek traditions, yet fully immersed in the Nubian context. The architecture of early Mercuria reflected this blend. Stone churches rose with rounded apses and barrel vaults. Interiors were painted in bold colors, saints, angels, kings in prayer. The royal palace at Dongola, built in later centuries on earlier foundations, showed signs of sophisticated planning, columns, storerooms, audience halls. It was not a rough fortress. It was a court of culture. Mercuria quickly distinguished itself from its neighbors. Unlike the smaller and often embattled Nubia, Mercuria had space to expand. Unlike the distant Alodia, it had early access to Egypt's changing currents. And unlike Mero before it, Mercuria was fully Christian from the start. Its political structure grew increasingly centralized. The king, often called the core, stood as both sovereign and servant of God. He ruled with authority, advised by bishops, nobles, and sometimes even queens or queen mothers. Laws were issued in Greek or Old Nubian. Tribute was gathered in cattle, grain, and cloth. Justice was administered through both church and palace. The people of Mercuria, farmers, herders, merchants, lived with a quiet dignity. They cultivated sorghum and barley, raised goats and cattle, sailed reed boats down the Nile. In towns, potters turned local clay into painted vessels. Blacksmiths shaped tools. Children learned to read from psalters and gospel pages. The kingdom's strength grew steadily. By the end of the 6th century, Mercuria had absorbed Nubia, uniting northern and central Nubia into a single Christian polity. Its armies, skilled with bows and familiar with the land, stood ready to defend its borders. Its churches rang with liturgy. Its river carried both commerce and blessing. The Nile, flowing past Dongola, knew the rhythm of kingdoms. It had seen pride rise and fall, stone crumble and renew. Now it flowed past a city that stood for more than power, a city built on faith, order, and the long memory of a land reborn. Mercuria had risen. And the river remembered. Along the gentle bend of the Nile, where the desert rolls down into fertile fields, the city of Old Dongola took shape, not in haste, not by chance, but with purpose. It was to be the crown of Mercuria, its spiritual seat, its military stronghold, and its beating heart. At first, Dongola was simple, a riverside town of mud brick and stone. But by the 6th century, as Mercuria solidified its power, the city began to transform. Walls were raised. Roads were laid. Markets and granaries appeared. And at the center, rising above the river, stood the royal palace. This palace, whose ruins still speak in silence today, was a sprawling complex of halls, staircases, towers, and vaulted rooms. It was not a fortress, but a seat of governance, where the king received envoys, consulted with bishops, and administered justice. The structure evolved over centuries, layered in renovations and expansions, reflecting a kingdom that was growing in confidence. Nearby stood the city's cathedrals and churches. The earliest churches were modest, single-aisled, with mud brick walls and timber roofs. But soon, more elaborate designs took form, basilicas with rounded apses, arched windows, and stone altars. Their walls were covered with paintings of saints and angels, often facing the royal throne, as if to bear witness to the sacred charge of rule. Dongola was not only political, it was deeply sacred. Beneath its streets, monks walked in silence to and from their monasteries. Liturgical chants echoed through narrow alleys. The day was marked by prayer and labor, by ceremony and civic life. The clergy and the nobility walked side by side, not always in harmony, but always within the same sacred framework. The city also became a center of learning and literacy. Scribes copied gospel texts and psalters in Greek, Coptic, and eventually Old Nubian, the latter emerging as the administrative and liturgical language of the kingdom. It was in Dongola that much of this scriptural and legal tradition was cultivated. Libraries were modest, but enduring. Stone inscriptions recorded royal decrees and church dedications, carved to last beneath the desert sky. Life within the city walls reflected a complex and stable society. Merchants sold spices, cloth, incense, and pottery. Artisans worked in iron, wood, and bone. Bakers and brewers supplied households and monasteries. The economy was rooted in agriculture, fields irrigated by Nile canals, tended by free farmers and royal dependents. Taxes were collected in kind, grain, honey, textiles, livestock. The urban planning of Dongola was practical and organic. Houses of varying size clustered near public squares. Streets followed the slope of the land. Wells and storage pits were scattered between homes. The city was not grand in the Roman sense, but it was living, vibrant, and full of purpose. Dongola also stood as a symbol. To its north, former Nubatian towns remained vital. To the south, the open plains stretched toward Alodia. From its gates rode messengers, soldiers, and priests, bearing the authority of the Mercurian king, now ruler of a land stretching hundreds of miles along the Nile. And always, the river flowed beside the city. Its waters fed the fields. Its current carried trade. Its surface reflected the domes of churches, the glow of lanterns at dusk, the flicker of crosses raised at festival. The Nile had known pharaohs, conquerors, rebels. Now, it knew a city built on faith, a capital that would endure for centuries. Old Dongola, the soul of Mercuria, had taken its place in history. And the river remembered. The middle of the 6th century brought more than kingship to Mercuria. It brought a new spirit, a change not only in rule, but in the heart of the people. For it was then, sometime around the year 570 CE, that Mercuria embraced Christianity. The path had been prepared. To the north, Nubatia had already converted. To the south, Alodia would follow. Egypt, once a land of pharaohs, was now a land of monks and bishops. And from Egypt came the missionaries, Coptic and Byzantine, sometimes in rivalry, always bearing the same cross. One of these was Longinus, a monk from Egypt, said to have baptized not only Nubatian nobles but also Mercurian kings. The accounts differ in detail. What matters is the result. The king of Mercuria, surrounded by his court and guided by the bishops of Alexandria, received baptism, and with him, his kingdom was transformed. It was not a swift or sudden change. Old gods had deep roots in the land. Local spirits, ancestral rites, the rhythms of a people long shaped by Mero and desert tradition, all of this did not vanish in a day. But the kings of Mercuria made the transition with care and conviction. Temples were not torn down. They were repurposed. Shrines became chapels. Priests became deacons. The sacred spaces of the old world were folded into the new Christian order, their stones carrying forward the reverence of generations. Churches rose across the land. At Old Dongola, the first Christian structures were simple, wooden roofs, mud brick walls, painted crosses. But in time, more enduring buildings appeared, basilicas with apses, columns, and vaulted ceilings. Their interiors gleamed with frescoes, scenes from Scripture, rows of saints, the crucified Christ. Bishops were appointed, often trained in Coptic Egypt, yet fully at home in Nubia. They became spiritual leaders, political advisors, and voices of order in times of crisis. Monasteries sprang up near the Nile and in the desert hills. Some housed a dozen monks. Others grew into centers of learning, scriptural study, and prayer. The liturgy followed the Alexandrian rite, but was spoken in voices that bore the rhythm of Nubian dialect. Hymns echoed across fields at dawn. Gospel pages were read aloud in the courts of kings. The people gathered on feast days, carrying candles and palm branches, their lives now marked by the calendar of the Church. Christianity also reshaped law and kingship. The king, now a servant of Christ, ruled not only by lineage, but by divine grace. He became a patron of churches, a defender of the faith, a protector of the poor. Bishops stood beside him, often crowned in icons beside Mary or Christ, not as subjects, but as intercessors. Art changed. Names changed. Language changed. But the people remained. They planted as they always had. They fished and herded as their fathers had done. And in their homes, alongside family relics and ancestral charms, they placed small wooden crosses, oil lamps with sacred symbols, and verses from the Psalms. The conversion of Mercuria was not a severing. It was a blending, a sanctifying of what had come before, a redirection of belief toward a single, shining cross. And the Nile bore witness. Its waters had received the tears of the dead, the ashes of sacrifice, the blood of war. Now, they received the sacrament of baptism. Infants were dipped in its flow. Monks drew water for their rites. The river became a living font, a source of grace. And it remembered. Between the 9th and 11th centuries, the kingdom of Mercuria reached its fullest bloom. It was a time of peace, of wealth, of faith, and of dignity. A time when the Nile Valley, from the first cataract to the edge of Alodia, was united under one crown, Christian, Nubian, and sovereign. This was Mercuria's golden age. At its center stood the capital, Old Dongola, no longer a frontier town, but a city of power and prestige. The royal palace now stood vast and layered, rebuilt many times over generations. Its walls bore witness to ceremonies, councils, and coronations. The king ruled not as a warlord, but as a Christian monarch, protector of the church, keeper of the law, shepherd of his people. Churches in the capital and beyond were adorned with frescoes, kings robed in white, angels with lifted wings, saints who gazed with serene purpose. Bishops walked with dignity through the streets. Monks prayed in desert cells. The sound of bells, chant, and gospel filled the land. The Mercurian army, while not vast, was respected. Its archers, famed for their precision, were its pride. Fortresses dotted the Nile banks, guarding towns and caravan routes. But war was rare. Mercuria had little need to conquer. It was secure, defended by river, desert, treaty, and faith. That treaty was the Pact, an agreement signed with the Muslim rulers of Egypt in the 7th century. It had preserved peace between Mercuria and its northern neighbor for generations. Under its terms, the two powers exchanged gifts, maintained trade, and respected each other's sovereignty. It was one of the longest-standing diplomatic accords in medieval history. And so the kingdom flourished. Mercurian merchants traded with Egypt, the Red Sea coast, and even distant lands to the south and east. Goods moved quietly: ivory, hides, incense, gold, ostrich feathers. In return came textiles, manuscripts, wine, and artisans. In villages along the Nile, life was rich in rhythm. Farmers tilled fields with wooden plows, guided by the floods. Potters shaped jars and amphorae. Weavers produced fine cloth. Children studied with village priests, learning to read the Psalms and write their names in Old Nubian, now the kingdom's written tongue. This period saw the full development of a Nubian Christian culture, not borrowed, but born of the land. Art became distinct: soft outlines, deep colors, almond eyes, and full-bodied figures. Theology took on local tone. Architecture adapted to the heat and soil. Language fused Egyptian, Greek, and African influences into something wholly Mercurian. The king stood at the pinnacle, not remote, but revered. In frescoes, he appears beside Mary, offering a church or kneeling in devotion. He ruled with bishops, advised by nobles, and bound by laws both written and sacred. His court was not ostentatious, but ordered, steady, a place of judgment, mercy, and ritual. This was not an empire of gold and war. It was an empire of faith and structure, of beauty and balance. One that endured not through expansion, but through cohesion, a kingdom so well-rooted that it stood peacefully for centuries, untouched by the turmoil that roiled other lands. And the Nile, serene and unhurried, flowed through it all. It passed cathedrals whose domes gleamed in the sun. It carried boats bearing grain and scripture. It whispered through reeds and over stones, always steady, always remembering. In these centuries, Mercuria stood as a crown upon the river's brow. And the river remembered. Long before embassies and formal borders, two kingdoms, one Muslim, one Christian, forged a peace that would outlast dynasties, outlive conquerors, and shape the rhythm of life along the Nile for over 6 centuries. This was the Pact. Signed around 652 CE, the Pact was not a treaty in the modern sense. It was a covenant, a solemn agreement between Mercuria and the newly established Muslim rulers of Egypt, soon governed from Fustat under the Rashidun Caliphate. The document itself does not survive in full, but its terms were remembered and recorded in chronicles, both Arabic and Coptic. At its heart, the Pact established peace. Mercuria, which had resisted the Muslim advance at the Battle of Dornola, where its archers had inflicted severe losses and famously blinded the enemy commander, would not be conquered. Egypt, unwilling to bleed further in the unforgiving Nubian terrain, sought a diplomatic path. And so it was agreed. There would be no war between the two realms. Mercuria would send an annual tribute, mostly slaves, often numbering in the hundreds, alongside goods like ivory and ostrich feathers. In return, Egypt would supply grain, cloth, and horses. Freedom of movement was granted for travelers, pilgrims, and traders across the border. And above all, Mercuria would remain independent, its churches untouched, its kings sovereign. It was an extraordinary arrangement, unprecedented in the early Islamic world. Elsewhere, Christian lands fell to the sword. Churches were taxed or torn down. Kings were dethroned or converted. But in Nubia, a different rhythm took hold, one of cautious respect, mutual benefit, and diplomatic patience. The pact was renewed many times over the centuries. Sometimes it faltered. At times, tensions flared over late payments, shifting rulers, or border raids. But each time, the agreement was revived, not because of sentiment, but because it worked. For Mercuria, the pact provided stability. Its northern border was secure. Its traders had access to Egyptian markets. Its bishops maintained ties with the Coptic Patriarch of Alexandria, even after Egypt itself had become Muslim. And the kingdom was spared the violence that befell so many others. For Egypt, the pact offered quiet on a southern frontier. It ensured a flow of valuable goods and kept open the caravan routes that connected the Nile to the African interior. Mercurian envoys traveled regularly to Egypt, not in chains, but in ceremony. Dressed in white linen, they carried gifts and messages. In Cairo, they were received by caliphs and sultans, accorded respect. Arabic sources speak of these Nubian embassies with fascination, describing their customs, appearance, and the strangeness of a Christian kingdom that did not bend, yet did not provoke. And so the river flowed, not with warships, but with barges bearing tribute and trust. The Nile, ever ancient, carried the scrolls of peace from Dongola to Fustat, and bore back the silks and grains of Egypt to the heart of Mercuria. This treaty, this pact, was not a mere agreement. It was a testament to a way of ruling, one that chose diplomacy over dominance, dignity over submission, and endurance over ambition. It kept the Nile at peace. And the river remembered. As Mercuria reached the height of its power, something deeper than politics or trade began to take root, a quiet transformation, gradual and enduring. It was not imposed from above, nor sparked by war. It came from within. It was the Nubization of the kingdom. Though Mercuria had long embraced Christianity, it had done so through Coptic and Byzantine channels, receiving its bishops from Alexandria, writing in Greek or Coptic, painting icons in foreign styles. These connections remained. But by the 9th and 10th centuries, a distinctly Nubian Christian identity was taking shape. And its signs were subtle but unmistakable. The first was language. In the earliest Christian texts of Nubia, prayers and scripture were written in Greek, the language of the Eastern Mediterranean world, or in Coptic, the tongue of Egypt's church. But among the people, another voice spoke, the native Nubian language, once unwritten, now rising into script. From this blend emerged Old Nubian, a language written with a modified Coptic alphabet, enriched with signs from Greek and Meroitic, its ancestral script. This was not just a tool for conversation. It became a language of law, of liturgy, of poetry, and power. Old Nubian appeared in church inscriptions, royal edicts, and private letters. Monks copied psalms in it. Judges issued rulings with it. Kings were praised in hymns and recorded in chronicles, not in Greek, but in their own tongue. This shift was more than linguistic. It was cultural sovereignty. Mercuria was not breaking from Christianity, it was making it its own. Icons began to show Nubian saints with local features. Angels bore the faces of the people. Royal clothing, Court rituals, and even church architecture reflected local customs, adapted to climate, material, and tradition. Monasticism flourished in this new environment. Dozens of monasteries dotted the landscape, small communities of faith, often built of mud brick, set along the river or in rocky hills. Some were solitary, others centers of learning. They housed old Nubian manuscripts, written with care on parchment and decorated with vibrant initials and marginal art. The royal court also reflected this Nubianization. Kings were now depicted in murals with Nubian features, flanked not by Roman columns, but by local arches. Their names were written in Old Nubian. Their legitimacy no longer depended solely on Egyptian blessing, but on their rootedness in the land, their defense of the faith, and their justice among the people. Art and music followed suit. Paintings, while inspired by Coptic and Byzantine models, took on softer lines, warmer tones, and more earthy compositions. Music and chant, though never recorded in notation, likely blended ancient African rhythms with Christian hymns. The liturgical life of Mercuria sounded Nubian, not in form alone, but in soul. Even funerary practices reflected this blending. Christian tombs included not just crosses, but tokens of older belief, charms, painted vessels, personal items. The dead were buried with reverence, wrapped in linen, laid in arched graves, prayed over in a language their ancestors had never written, but now could read. And always, through all of it, the Nile carried this new identity from village to village. The river had known Egypt, Rome, and Meroe. Now it flowed through a kingdom that was Christian, African, and fully itself, not imitating the past, but growing from it. Mercuria had become Nubia, in voice, in worship, in art, in spirit. And the river remembered. In the land of Mercuria, faith was not only spoken, it was built. From the banks of the Nile to the edges of the desert, the kingdom gave rise to churches, monasteries, and palaces, each a testament to the unity of the sacred and the earthly. These were not monuments of ambition, but living spaces of prayer, ritual, and royal presence. They shaped the skyline and the soul of Mercuria. At the heart of this sacred architecture stood the Mercurian church, distinct, yet deeply rooted in the Christian world. The early churches, inspired by Coptic and Byzantine models, followed a common plan, a basilica with 3 aisles, a rounded apse at the eastern end, and sometimes a domed sanctuary. But over time, these forms evolved to meet the needs of the land, the climate, and the people. Builders used mud brick, sandstone, and timber. Roofs were flat or gently vaulted, often supported by arches and columns carved with local designs. Windows were narrow, letting in shafts of light. The floors were sometimes covered with simple mosaics or colored tiles, echoing Mediterranean influence but speaking in the earth tones of Nubia. The walls were the most striking. They were painted, not simply decorated. The art of Mercuria was bold, expressive, and deeply spiritual. Frescoes adorned the interiors of churches, telling the story of salvation not through text, but through color, form, and gesture. Figures were rendered with rounded faces, large, soulful eyes, and dark skin. Saints stood in robes of deep red and indigo, halos glowing softly around their heads. angels extended protective wings over rulers. The Virgin Mary cradled the Christ child, both gazing solemnly out at the worshipper. And the kings, they too were present. Often depicted kneeling, offering models of churches to Christ or the Virgin, the rulers of Mercuria were painted into sacred space, not as conquerors, but as servants of the divine. Their names, written in Old Nubian, accompanied these images, ensuring that the memory of their piety would not fade. Among the finest examples were the cathedral churches of Old Dongola, and the richly painted interiors of chapels in Foras, Abu Oda, and other towns. These sites became galleries of the sacred, places where the divine met the human in pigment and prayer. Inscriptions, too, played their part. Carved into walls, stone slabs, and wooden lintels, they recorded dedications, prayers, legal decrees, and historical events. Written in Greek, Coptic, and increasingly Old Nubian, they spoke to a literate elite and a faithful people. Many began with invocations, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and continued with words of offering, remembrance, or blessing. Architecture extended beyond churches. Monasteries, often modest in scale, combined prayer cells, communal dining halls, and small chapels. They were places of retreat, learning, and copying of sacred texts. Some became centers of pilgrimage. Others served as outposts of royal influence. The royal palace at Old Dongola, too, bore sacred marks. Though a seat of political power, it was also filled with chapels and inscriptions. Kings ruled not only with swords and scribes, but under the eyes of angels painted on their walls. This sacred architecture was not grandiose. It was devotional. It reflected not a hunger for display, but a culture of order, reverence, and spiritual depth. And the Nile, flowing past these structures, mirrored their walls at dawn and dusk, catching the flicker of candles in arched windows, the silhouettes of domes against the sky. The river had seen temples to Amun, shrines to Isis, pyramids to forgotten kings. Now it flowed through a land where stone and spirit moved as one. And the river remembered. In the land of Mercuria, power was not merely grasped, it was consecrated. The king ruled not only as sovereign, but as God's appointed guardian over a Christian kingdom. His palace lay at the center of Old Dongola, but his authority flowed across the Nile Valley, from the old border fortresses of Nubia to the southern reaches near Alodia. He was not distant. He was visible, painted on church walls, recorded in decrees, named in prayers. His crown bore the cross. His seal affirmed both justice and grace. He was the core, a title older than Mercuria itself, drawn from ancient Kush, but now bathed in the oil of Christian kingship. The monarchy of Mercuria was hereditary, but succession was not automatic. Though sons often followed fathers, the process was shaped by council, consensus, and the sacred weight of legitimacy. If a king ruled poorly, he might be deposed, not by rebellion, but by church and court, acting together to preserve the balance of the realm. There were no rigid laws of succession, but the will of the nobility and the bishopric held weight. This created a flexible yet stable system, one that allowed the throne to pass between brothers, nephews, or cousins if needed. At the heart of this system stood the Mercurian aristocracy. These were not simply landowners. They were governors, generals, priests, and patrons. Many held estates along the river, managed irrigation, led militias, and built churches in their regions. Some were monks. Others were warriors. But all served the king, and in doing so, served the sacred unity of kingdom and faith. The court of Dornola was a place of order, not opulence. Its halls echoed with prayer and judgment, not extravagance. Scribes recorded proceedings in Old Nubian. Messengers came and went by boat and caravan. Kings held audiences beneath frescoes of saints and beside bishops who advised on both law and spirit. The church, while distinct, was never far from the throne. The Bishop of Dornola, often the highest ecclesiastical figure in the land, was both a spiritual guide and a political actor. He could bless a king, but also restrain one. His authority reached deep into the countryside, through the network of priests and monastic communities loyal to both cross and crown. This interplay of sacred and political power defined Mercuria's uniqueness. Where other kingdoms separated altar and throne, Mercuria wove them together, not in domination, but in harmony. And because of this, the kingdom endured for centuries, through drought and diplomacy, pressure and peace. Justice in Mercuria was administered by royal officials and churchmen alike. Disputes were settled in courts, both civil and ecclesiastical. Punishments were tempered by mercy. Property rights were recorded. Marriages were sanctioned. The poor had recourse to bishops. The elite were held accountable to both law and gospel. The kingdom also maintained military leaders, often drawn from the noble class. They commanded the frontier fortresses, led archers in times of war, and ensured tribute and taxes reached Dornola. But they were not warlords. They operated within a realm governed by sacred order, not personal ambition. And the people? They lived within this structure not as subjects alone, but as participants in a society that offered stability, faith, and identity. They knew their king's name. They heard the church bell at sunrise. They paid their grain in tax, and received justice when wronged. And always, the Nile moved between palace and peasant, court and countryside. It carried royal messengers and monastic pilgrims alike. It knew the chants of bishops and the footsteps of kings. It bore the light of candles from cathedrals and the edicts of rulers sealed with the cross. Mercuria was not ruled by sword alone. It was held together by belief, balance, and a crown worn in humility. And the river remembered. By the close of the 12th century, the stillness that had long blessed Mercuria began to tremble. The kingdom, once a model of Christian order and diplomacy, now stood at the edge of a long dusk. Its decline would not come from a single blow, but from a slow and steady unraveling, worn by external pressure, internal strain, and the quiet erosion of time. The signs came first from the north. Egypt, once a relatively stable Muslim neighbor, entered a new phase of turbulence. The Fatimid Caliphate fell. The Ayyubid dynasty, led by Saladin, rose in its place, bringing a new assertiveness to Cairo. Later, the Mamluks, military rulers of slave soldier origin, took power, fierce, disciplined, and far less inclined toward peaceful cohabitation. The old back treaty, which had held firm for centuries, began to fracture. Mercuria could no longer depend on Egypt's goodwill. The yearly embassies became less regular. Disputes over tribute, border raids, and religious tensions began to sour the once peaceful relationship. At times, Muslim armies crossed the border. Some towns in northern Nubia fell under Egyptian influence or control. Mercuria still stood, but its grip weakened. At home, the kingdom faced its own internal strains. The royal court at Dornola, once so stable, now suffered from succession disputes. Kings came and went more frequently. Nobles quarreled. At times, rival claimants to the throne emerged. In some cases, bishops were drawn into these disputes, or worse, appointed as kings themselves, blurring the line between altar and crown. Famine and climatic changes deepened the struggle. The Nile's flood cycles, once reliable, grew erratic. Harvests failed. Trade declined. In some years, entire regions suffered hunger. As economic strain mounted, loyalty weakened. Border regions drifted away from royal control. The once proud unity of Mercuria began to unravel into fragments. Worse still was the slow but steady Islamization of the north. Though Mercuria remained Christian, parts of Nabatea and Lower Nubia, under pressure from Egypt and local conversions, began to turn toward Islam. Arabic replaced Old Nubian in trade and law. Mosques appeared where churches had once stood. In time, even members of the nobility began to straddle two worlds, speaking the language of the Quran but still swearing by the cross. The kingdom's core, Old Dornola and its southern provinces, resisted these shifts for a time. The church still held sway. Bishops still ruled beside kings. Monasteries continued their chants. But the pressure mounted. By the 13th century, Mercuria had become a realm under siege, not by armies alone, but by change itself. In 1276, a Mamluk invasion sacked Dornola. Though the city recovered, the blow was deep. Further campaigns followed in later decades. Each time, the kingdom lost something: a town, a noble house, a monastery. And each time, the flame of Mercuria flickered lower. By the 14th century, the capital itself began to fall into silence. Churches closed. Walls crumbled. Bishops disappeared from the records. The line of kings faded. Only scattered inscriptions, buried churches, and desert bones remained to speak of what had once been. But even as it declined, Mercuria did not vanish in disgrace. It faded with dignity, holding the faith, defending its people, preserving a sacred order until the last. And the Nile, once the kingdom's lifeblood, flowed on. It had carried kings and saints, traders and monks, decrees and hymns. Now it carried only memory. And it remembered. By the late 15th century, the kingdom of Mercuria, once the beacon of Christian Nubia, was no more. Its city stood silent. Its cathedrals, once filled with incense and chant, lay open to wind and sand. The crown had passed into silence. The river bore no more embassies. The kingdom had disappeared, not with a roar, but with a whisper. The final centuries were marked by fragmentation. After repeated invasions by the Mamluks of Egypt in the 13th and 14th centuries, Mercuria's political structure weakened beyond repair. The capital, Old Dongola, once the proud seat of kings and bishops, fell into ruin. Local rulers, petty nobles and tribal leaders, began to assert control over smaller territories. No single king emerged with the strength to restore unity. The Christian Church, once the foundation of public life, also fell into decay. With no central authority to appoint bishops, many sees went vacant. Monasteries were abandoned. Churches, stripped of support, crumbled. The ancient language of Old Nubian ceased to be written. The sacred songs fell silent. In the north, Islam had already taken root. Arabic became the language of trade, law, and learning. Mosques rose where churches once stood. Conversion spread gradually, through marriage, commerce, migration. There was no violent purge. The change came slowly, but it was complete. By the 15th century, Mercuria's political structure had dissolved entirely. Into the vacuum stepped new powers. In the south, near the confluence of the White and Blue Niles, a new dynasty, the Funj, began to rise. Centered on Sennar, the Funj would go on to form the Sultanate of Sennar, an Islamic state that would dominate the region for centuries. In the north, Egypt's Mamluk and later Ottoman rulers extended their influence deeper into Nubian lands. Mercuria, once the guardian of the Christian Nile, was gone. And yet, something endured. Villages still bore Christian names. Crosses remained etched in stone. Oral traditions preserved the memory of kings and saints. In remote regions, pockets of Christianity survived for a time, isolated, quiet, yet bearing witness. In the 20th century, archaeologists would uncover the ruins of Old Dongola and Foras. They would lift frescoes from the sands, unroll scrolls from ancient libraries, read inscriptions forgotten for centuries. And they would find, in every wall and word, the memory of Mercuria. It had been a kingdom of faith and learning, of diplomacy and endurance. A realm that chose harmony over conquest, and dignity over domination. For 7 centuries, it stood, longer than many of its more famous neighbors, shaped by the river, guided by the cross. And the Nile, timeless as ever, flowed past its bones. It had seen empires rise and fall, temples and towers, prophets and kings. It had watched the coronation of Mercuria's first Christian monarch and the crumbling of his last cathedral. And it remembered. Far to the south, where the Nile branches into white and blue, where grasslands stretch wide and trees grow thick along riverbanks, a kingdom rose, quiet, enduring, and proud. Its name was Alodia, or as its people once called it, Alwa. It was the last heir of Kush, and the final stronghold of Christian Nubia. While Mercuria ruled the Middle Nile and Nabatea guarded the north, Alodia flourished in the south, in lands once touched by Mero, but now given over to new rhythms, a new people, a new kingdom. The exact date of Alodia's foundation is uncertain. It likely took shape in the 5th or early 6th century, not long after the final decline of the Meroitic state. Out of that fading light, local rulers, perhaps descended from Kushite nobles or tribal chieftains, forged a new kingdom, centered near the confluence of the Nile's two great branches. Its capital, though known by many names, is most often called Soba. Set near modern-day Khartoum, Soba was a city of river and red earth, built where the blue and white Niles meet. It became a thriving urban center, filled with palaces, churches, markets, and workshops. Arab travelers, centuries later, would speak of Soba with awe, describing wide streets, noble houses, and bustling markets. To them, it was a city of gold and grace, though time would not preserve its glory. Alodia was vast, likely larger in territory than Mercuria or Nabatea. It encompassed the fertile plains of the Jezera, the southern valleys, and the borderlands of the Ethiopian highlands. Its people were a blend of cultures, descendants of Kush, pastoralists from the interior, Christians from the north, traders from the Red Sea. And like its neighbors, Alodia became a Christian kingdom. It adopted the Coptic rite, received bishops from Alexandria, and raised churches of mud brick and stone. Its rulers were crowned in Christ's name. Its nobles built chapels. Its people, farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, lived by the calendar of the church, marking feasts, fasting days, and seasons with prayer. Yet Alodia was not simply a mirror of Mercuria. It developed in relative isolation, far from the direct influence of Egypt or the Mediterranean. This gave it a distinct flavor, culturally rich, locally rooted. Its Christianity was sincere and deep, but less bound by foreign forms. Its people likely spoke early dialects of Nubian mixed with local languages. Its art, its rituals, its way of governance bore traces of older African traditions, shaped now by the cross. Trade sustained the kingdom. Caravans passed through Soba, bringing ivory, gold, iron, cattle, and grain. From the Red Sea coast and beyond came cloth, incense, beads, and, later, whispers of Islam. Alodia sat at the crossroads of Africa's heart, and it drew its strength from this position. For centuries, it endured, peaceful, prosperous, and mostly hidden from the storms of the outside world. While Mercuria wrestled with Egypt and held the Bact, Alodia looked south and east. It maintained its own alliances, its own balance. And because of its distance from the great powers of the Nile and the Mediterranean, it escaped many of the invasions and entanglements that plagued its neighbors. But even Alodia, rich in soil and spirit, would not endure forever. In the chapters to come, we shall trace its rise further, its cities, its churches, its kings. And we shall follow it into its long twilight. But for now, in this hour of origin, Alodia stood whole. And the Nile, where white met blue, carried its voice downstream, a final crown upon the river's brow. And the river remembered. To understand Alodia, one must begin with the land. Unlike the narrow corridor of the northern Nile, hemmed in by cliffs and sand, Alodia sprawled wide across the central Sudanese plains, a land of green floodplains, broad savannas, and gently rolling hills. Here, the river opened, and the kingdom stretched with it, not constrained by geography, but nourished by it. At the heart of Alodia's domain lay the confluence, where the White Nile, slow and silty, met the Blue Nile, swift and seasonal, just south of what is today Khartoum. This confluence was more than a geographical feature. It was a symbol of union, of fertility, of power drawn from water. Near this sacred meeting stood Soba, the capital. Soba was not a walled fortress like old Dornola. It was open and expansive, a city of sun-dried brick, timber, and stone. It rose gently from the river bank, spreading out over the land like a net cast in still water. Travelers from later centuries would describe it as a place of grandeur and light, wide streets, tall houses, richly adorned churches, and markets humming with trade. The city's heart held the royal palace, perhaps a complex of buildings rather than a single citadel. Here, the king held court, governed the realm, and led great processions during feast days. Nearby rose the main cathedral, its walls adorned with painted saints and lined with stone columns. Around it clustered smaller churches, chapels, and monastic houses. Soba was also a hub of trade. Goods flowed north along the Nile and east toward the Red Sea ports. Ivory, leopard skins, incense, and gold passed through its markets. Craftsmen worked in iron, pottery, and textiles. Local farmers brought grain, millet, and cattle. And caravans brought glass, beads, and textiles from distant lands. Beyond Soba, Alodia governed a vast region. The Jezera, a rich stretch of land between the White and Blue Niles, formed the kingdom's agricultural backbone. Further south lay lands more wooded and wild, where pastoral communities grazed their herds and lived in smaller settlements. These regions, though far from the court, were vital, providing tribute, soldiers, and stability. The kingdom's power rested on a network of local elites, church leaders, and royal envoys. Governors, likely appointed by the king, administered provinces, collected taxes, and oversaw justice. Bishops served as both spiritual guides and political allies, ensuring that the church remained tied to the crown. There is no record of a standing army, but militia forces likely existed, raised from the countryside in times of need, led by nobles or royal appointees. Their role was not conquest, but defense and order. Yet despite its breadth, Alodia did not boast of empire. Its strength was in stability, not aggression. Its cities rose not in rivalry, but in service to the land. Its people, shaped by the river and the church, lived in a rhythm as old as the rains. And always, the Nile flowed. It carried messages from Soba to distant provinces. It bore monks and merchants, kings and commoners. It passed quiet villages where prayers rose with the smoke of cooking fires, and grand churches where the faithful gathered in colored robes. Alodia, spread wide like the open hands of the river, drew its life from the land. And the river remembered. Within the warm heart of Alodia, amid the wide river plains and golden fields, a culture flourished, rich in memory, sacred in rhythm, and deeply Christian in soul. It was a world shaped by ritual and order, by local tradition and spiritual grace, by the river's voice and the church's song. Here, the sacred and the everyday were never far apart. Alodia's people were farmers and fishermen, potters and priests, nobles and scribes. They lived in mud brick homes with palm roofs, planted fields with sorghum and millet, herded cattle, and gathered at market stalls. But their lives were marked not only by labor, but by liturgical time, the cycle of feasts, fasts, prayers, and seasons that gave shape to the Christian year. At the center of cultural life stood the church. It was not distant, nor reserved for kings. Every village had its chapel, every town its priests. Churches were often built of mud brick, coated in white plaster, adorned with simple crosses. Larger churches in sober and other towns bore frescoes, saints in colored robes, archangels with outstretched wings, the Virgin Mary enthroned. These churches were places of ritual, justice, and memory. Within their walls, children were baptized, lovers were married, elders were buried. They served not only as houses of prayer, but as schools, meeting places, and community centers. Alodia followed the Coptic rite, aligned with the Church of Alexandria. Bishops were appointed from among the local clergy, often educated in monastic schools. Monks lived in modest monasteries, tending gardens, copying manuscripts, and guiding the faithful. The language of the court and church was likely a form of Old Nubian, influenced by Coptic and local dialects. Though no extensive texts survive from Alodia, inscriptions and oral tradition suggest that literacy was present, at least among the clergy and elite. Texts would have included gospel readings, psalms, and perhaps legal documents or letters. Art and craft also flourished. Pottery was both functional and decorative, red and black ware, incised with patterns, shaped into jugs, bowls, and lamps. Metalwork, though simpler than in Egypt, included tools, jewelry, and liturgical items, crosses, censers, and chalices. Textiles, dyed with local plants, clothed both commoners and nobles in flowing robes. Music, though unrecorded, likely played a central role in church, in celebration, in mourning. It would have drawn from African rhythms, shaped by drum, hand, and voice. The songs of Alodia are lost to us now, but they once echoed across fields and sanctuaries alike. The institutions of power mirrored those of Mercuria. The king ruled as a servant of Christ, advised by bishops, nobles, and palace officials. Law blended custom and canon. Justice was administered locally, often in the presence of a priest. Taxes were paid in goods, grain, cattle, cloth, and used to sustain the court, the army, and the church. Life was simple, but not poor. Modest, but not small. It was a life that flowed with the river, marked by sunrise and feast days, by market bells and sacred chants. A life where the faith was not foreign, but had taken root, growing in the soil of tradition, blossoming in the art of prayer. And the Nile, steady and slow, passed by it all. It flowed beside churches that faced east, beside monasteries wrapped in silence. It watered fields where children played and elders remembered. It carried the sacred and the ordinary alike. And the river remembered. Though Alodia lay far from the heart of empires, it was never alone. Its southern plains and eastern hills, its riverine heartlands and distant marches, all were touched by others. Kingdoms rose and fell nearby. Trade routes wound through its towns. Messengers crossed borders. And in all these movements, Alodia found both companionship and caution. To the northwest stood Mercuria, for many centuries Alodia's Christian sibling. Their relationship was not merely diplomatic, it was spiritual, cultural, and likely familial. Bishops were exchanged. Monks traveled freely. The two kingdoms shared liturgies, saints, and scriptural texts. Whether Alodia was always politically independent from Mercuria is debated. Some scholars believe that the two kingdoms may have been loosely federated, with Alodia recognizing Mercuria's primacy in church matters or even paying symbolic tribute. Others argue that Alodia retained sovereignty throughout its history, choosing cooperation over submission. What is certain is that peace prevailed between them. No wars are recorded. No boundary disputes mar the record. Together, they formed a Christian bloc in the heart of Africa, strong enough to endure while empires crumbled around them. To the northeast, beyond the desert and the sea, lay the old highland kingdom of Aksum. Aksum, once a great power with its own Christian tradition, had declined by Alodia's rise. Yet its cultural memory remained, and its spiritual influence lingered. Some trade and communication may have passed between Alodia and the Christian highlands of Ethiopia, though the rugged terrain and political fragmentation made direct ties rare and difficult. Still, the presence of Christian neighbors, however distant, gave Alodia a sense of belonging in a wider sacred world. To the north, relations with Muslim Egypt were more distant than in Mercuria. There was no back treaty, no regular embassies. Alodia's geographic isolation kept it shielded from direct military pressure, but also removed from the diplomatic channels that Mercuria had used for centuries. Nonetheless, indirect trade passed through Nubia to Egypt, and merchants likely carried news and goods in both directions. To the east, trade routes ran to the Red Sea, where ports like Idhab and Suakin connected Inner Africa to the broader Islamic world. Here, Alodia met the Arab world, not in war, but in commerce. From these routes came goods, ideas, and, over time, the quiet encroachment of Islamic culture, especially in border regions. To the south, the frontier was looser. Here lay lands of pastoralists, small polities, and mobile peoples, some trading partners, others potential raiders. Alodia likely maintained fortified outposts, alliances with local chiefs, and seasonal patrols. But for the most part, its southern edges remained open, a place of movement, exchange, and storytelling. And always, the Nile flowed through all these interactions. It carried ivory northward and glass southward. It bore monks and merchants, fishers, and foreign emissaries. It passed borders not marked by walls, but by trust, memory, and understanding. Alodia stood in the middle, not a power of conquest, but of connection. It was a kingdom that listened, rather than shouted. That chose continuity over domination. And in doing so, it endured longer than many more famous states. And the river remembered. In a world of shifting sands and rising empires, Alodia endured. While powers clashed in Egypt, while dynasties rose and fell along the Red Sea, while Mercuria struggled under the weight of northern pressure, Alodia, southern, distant, and self-contained, held its course. Its strength lay not in conquest, but in continuity. For nearly 1,000 years, Alodia survived as a Christian kingdom, a rarity in the African interior. It maintained its rights, its ruling line, its monastic traditions. Its capital at Soba remained vibrant, the city of processions and prayers, of scholars and craftsmen. Even as distant kingdoms fell, Alodia held fast. There were no great wars recorded. No vast conquests. No sweeping reforms. The kingdom did not seek empire. It sought stability, and for centuries, it achieved it. This long endurance was due in part to geography. The vast open plains around the Blue Nile provided room to grow, but also created a buffer from invading armies. To reach Alodia meant long journeys across hard terrain. Few found it worth the cost. And so Alodia was spared the attention and devastation that often fell upon more accessible lands. Its isolation became its protection. But isolation could also bring fragility. Though the capital and nearby regions prospered, distant provinces may have grown more autonomous over time. Local chiefs and nobles might have asserted independence in quiet ways, withholding taxes, ignoring decrees, favoring their own customs. The center held, but perhaps less tightly than before. Still, the church stood firm. Even as central authority waned, the network of churches and monasteries helped bind the kingdom. Liturgical life continued. Priests served the sacraments. Bishops guided the faithful. Crosses still rose over villages, and psalms were still sung at sunrise. Yet change crept in, softly at first, then steadily. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Islamic traders and migrants had begun to settle in northern and eastern parts of Alodia. They brought Arabic language, new customs, new ideas. Some converted. Others blended the two traditions. A slow, uneven Islamization began, not through violence, but through proximity. The Christian faith remained, but its territory grew smaller. The court of Soba still crowned kings. The cathedral still stood. But the kingdom's reach had shortened. Its confidence had faded. It was a long twilight, not a sudden nightfall. Alodia's endurance is perhaps its most remarkable legacy. It did not conquer lands or build pyramids. It did not leave behind gold or chronicles in marble halls. It left instead a memory of resilience, of quiet strength, of faith that held its ground for centuries. And always, the Nile bore it witness. From the white waters of the south to the fields of Soba, the river flowed. It watered the crops. It carried prayers. It touched every life that rose and slept beneath the cross. And in its silent memory, Alodia still lives. By the dawn of the 16th century, the kingdom of Alodia, once the southern guardian of Christian Nubia, stood at the edge of extinction. Its fall did not come from a single blow. There were no great battles recorded. No last stands. No mournful epics carved in stone. Instead, it was a slow unraveling, the end of a kingdom by erosion, not by fire. The signs had long been present. Trade routes had shifted. New powers had emerged. The Islamic world, once distant and confined to Egypt's north, had crept steadily southward, not with armies alone, but with commerce, language, and belief. Along Alodia's borders, Arabic became common. mosques appeared where chapels had once stood. And then came the Funj, a rising power from the southern regions near the Blue Nile. The Funj were a people of mixed origin, part indigenous, part Islamicized, part nomadic, part urban. They were organized, ambitious, and well-positioned. By the late 15th century, they had already begun consolidating nearby territories. By the early 1500s, the Funj moved on sober. The city, long the crown of Alodia, was now exhausted. Its palaces, once filled with kings, had grown silent. Its churches, once adorned with icons, had lost their painters. Its fields had thinned. Its people, some still Christian, others newly Muslim, were unprepared to resist. The Funj, led by Amoradunkas, took the city. There is no record of siege or slaughter. Only the simple fact, Alodia was no more. Its king, whose name is lost to time, vanished into silence. The cathedral fell into ruin. The monarchy dissolved. The Christian Church of Nubia, with its final anchor in Alodia, now had no throne to shelter it. In its place rose the Funj Sultanate of Sennar, an Islamic state, one that would rule for centuries over central Sudan. Some remnants of Christian practice lingered, quietly, in rural corners. A few crosses carved in stone. A prayer whispered in an older tongue. A memory held by elders. But in time, even these would fade. The Nubian Christian civilization, which had lasted more than 1,000 years, from the fall of Meroe to the twilight of Soba, had come to an end. And yet, not everything was lost. In the 20th century, the ruins of Soba were rediscovered, pottery shards, church walls, traces of the past beneath layers of earth. A few frescoes. Scattered foundations. The echo of hymns in broken stone. They speak still. They tell of a people who lived by the river, who built churches with faith and hands, who crowned their kings with crosses, who held firm when others fell. A people who endured longer than Rome, longer than Byzantium, longer than the caliphates that once surrounded them. And through it all, the Nile watched. It had carried the prayers of Alodia for centuries. It had mirrored its cathedrals, quenched its fields, cradled its children. Now it flowed past ruins. But it remembered. As the sun sets on the kingdom of Alodia, its light does not vanish. It joins the long memory of the river, a memory of faith, peace, and quiet greatness. And the river remembered. Long after the cathedrals of Mercuria fell into silence, and the palaces of Alodia crumbled beneath the dust, a quiet question remained: what had been lost, and what remained? For centuries, the memory of Christian Nubia vanished from the world's gaze. No kings were sung in epic. No chronicles were copied in distant courts. Even in Egypt and the Arab world, the names of Dornola and Soba faded into fable. The story of 1,000-year-old Christian civilization, African, independent, and sovereign, passed into silence. But not into nothingness. The memory lived on, not in parchment or marble, but in stone, in soil, and in the river's path. Beneath the sands of northern Sudan, the remnants of Nubia, Mercuria, and Alodia waited. Their churches had been buried, not destroyed. their frescoes sealed in darkness, not erased. Their cities, though abandoned, still held their shape. And slowly, in modern centuries, that world began to be uncovered. In the early 20th century, archaeologists, many from Poland, Britain, and Sudan, began to explore the forgotten churches and cities of ancient Nubia. What they found shocked the world. At Foras, frescoes were discovered that rivaled the art of Byzantium, serene saints with Nubian features, queens beside the Virgin Mary, kings kneeling before Christ. Entire walls were lifted, preserved, and now rest in museums in Warsaw and Khartoum. At Old Dongola, the ruins of palaces, monasteries, and cathedrals revealed a refined civilization, one that blended African, Coptic, and Byzantine elements into something uniquely Nubian. At Soba, pottery, church foundations, and traces of frescoes whispered of Elodia's long peace. The old Nubian language, once thought lost, was rediscovered in inscriptions and manuscripts. Slowly, it began to be read. And with it came a voice, the voice of a people who had once prayed, governed, and lived by the rhythm of the Nile. Today, Christian Nubia stands not as a footnote, but as a civilization in its own right. A civilization that ruled itself for over a millennium, built cities of stone and sanctuaries of faith, chose diplomacy over domination, preserved Christian tradition deep within Africa, crafted a legacy not of empire, but of endurance. Its story is still being pieced together by scholars, by Sudanese communities, by the descendants of those who once prayed beneath painted domes. The river has not forgotten. And now, neither shall we. The story of Christian Nubia might have remained forever lost, buried beneath centuries of dust, forgotten by maps, and absent from the histories told in foreign tongues. But the earth remembered. And one day, men and women would come, spades in hand and questions in heart, to listen to what it had to say. The rediscovery of Nubia began in earnest in the 19th and early 20th centuries, as European explorers, missionaries, and archaeologists traveled south along the Nile. At first, they sought traces of Egypt, temples, tombs, pharaohs. But what they found further upstream was something else. They uncovered churches, not temples. Crosses, not hieroglyphs. And in place of pagan kings, they found Christian monarchs, painted on walls and named in unfamiliar scripts. The real turning point came in the 1960s, as Egypt prepared to build the Aswan High Dam. The rising waters would soon flood vast regions of ancient Nubia. In response, an international rescue mission was launched, led by UNESCO, to salvage what could be saved. Among the most dramatic discoveries was the Cathedral of Foras, near the Egyptian-Sudanese border. There, beneath layers of mud brick and centuries of silence, archaeologists uncovered an astonishing treasure, vivid frescoes, painted between the 8th and 14th centuries, still intact. Saints and angels in Byzantine style, with unmistakably Nubian faces. Bishops robed in liturgical finery, their names preserved in Old Nubian. Kings and queens standing before Christ, offering churches as symbols of faith. These frescoes were carefully removed and preserved. Today, many rest in the National Museum in Warsaw, while others reside in Khartoum. They are some of the finest Christian artworks ever found in Africa, equal in beauty to those of Ravenna or Constantinople. Other major sites followed. At Old Dongola, excavations revealed a massive royal palace, a cathedral built in multiple phases, monastic quarters filled with painted walls and everyday objects. The old Nubian language began to yield its secrets, thanks to bilingual inscriptions and surviving manuscripts. Scholars from Sudan, Poland, Britain, and elsewhere began to reconstruct the history, theology, and administration of the Nubian kingdoms. Each find brought new clarity and new wonder. For the first time in centuries, the Christian past of Sudan was visible. Not as a curiosity, but as a civilization. Not as a shadow of Egypt, but as a culture in its own right, African, Christian, literate, sovereign. The people of modern Sudan, many of whom descend from these ancient communities, began to reclaim this legacy. For too long, the Christian past had been distant, thought foreign, irrelevant, or erased. But the frescoes of Foras, the ruins of Soba, and the prayers in Old Nubian told another story. A story of faithful kings, devout communities, and 1,000 years of continuity. And always, in the background, the Nile flowed on. It had once carried the bodies of bishops, the words of kings, the breath of monks. Now it carried the whisper of discovery and the hope of remembrance. Once, along the Nile, there had been cathedrals of stone, processions of incense, and kings who ruled in the name of Christ. And then, silence. The story of Nubia's Christian kingdoms vanished so completely from the memory of the world that for centuries, they were scarcely mentioned, even in the lands where they once stood. The reasons for this forgetting are many, layered like the silt of the Nile itself. The first was the nature of their decline. Mercuria and Alodia did not fall in dramatic battle, did not leave behind piles of chronicles or triumphant monuments. They faded, slowly, overtaken by new powers, new faiths, new languages. Their churches became ruins, their cities drifted into the sand. Unlike Egypt or Byzantium, they left no great libraries, no preserved scrolls passed from generation to generation. The rise of Islam across North and East Africa played a part. As the Nubian kingdoms weakened and Islamic powers grew stronger, the Christian story was eclipsed. In time, Arabic became the dominant language. The cross gave way to the crescent. And while Islam preserved many traditions of the past, it did not preserve Christian Nubia's memory, at least, not in the form its people once knew. There were no historians in Europe to tell the story either. Unlike Ethiopia, which maintained ties to Christian Europe, Nubia was unknown. Its name barely appeared on medieval maps. Western pilgrims and chroniclers passed it by. Even when Arab geographers described Dongola and Soba, their words were few, their understanding limited. Time, too, played its part. With each passing generation, more of Nubia's sacred past was lost to erosion, flooding, and decay. Churches collapsed. Manuscripts turned to dust. Language shifted. Villagers lived beside ruins without names, unaware of what once stood there. By the 18th and 19th centuries, even the people of Sudan had little knowledge of the Christian kingdoms that had shaped their land for centuries. But silence is not the end of memory. It is only its sleep. The memory of Nubia was never entirely gone. It lived in the stones beneath the ground, in the buried walls of forests, in the silent outlines of Dongola's cathedrals, in the forgotten graves of kings who once ruled by prayer. It lived, too, in the unspoken gestures of communities, in symbols etched into pottery, in place names that held ancient echoes, in customs whose roots were deeper than anyone knew. And then, one day, the silence broke. The sands were brushed away. The frescoes saw the sun again. The inscriptions were read once more. And with that, Christian Nubia rose again, not as a kingdom, but as a memory restored. Not forgotten, only waiting. And always, the Nile remembered. The Nile has no voice, and yet it speaks. It does not record, yet it remembers. It has watched kings rise and crumble, temples drown in dust, and prayers echo over silent water. And through all the ages, it has flowed, slow, enduring, eternal. Now, as we stand at the end of this long telling, 40 chapters of memory, loss, and rediscovery, we return to the river. For it is here, more than anywhere, that the story of Nubia resides. The kingdoms of Nabatea, Mercuria, and Alodia are gone. Their cities lie in ruin. Their rulers are nameless to most. Their churches, once alive with incense and chant, are silent. But this silence is not emptiness. It is depth. It is the silence of long history, of a civilization that built not for show, but for meaning. That did not seek fame, but faith. That chose to endure quietly rather than burn brightly and vanish. They ruled for over 1,000 years. In a world of short-lived powers, this is no small feat. They governed wisely, they prayed deeply, they wrote in their own tongue, they blended African roots with Christian grace. They stood, year after year, by the river. They built cities of peace, defended themselves with diplomacy, and adorned their walls with saints who looked like themselves. And when they were gone, the river kept flowing. The Nile has passed under the shadows of Kushite pyramids, beside the shrines of Amun, past the walls of Meroe, through the courts of Dongola, and around the broken stones of Soba. It has carried the sacred dust of bishops, the song of monks, the silence of forgotten queens. And still it flows. Today, the ruins remain, not as relics, but as witnesses. In Foras, in Dongola, in the museums of Warsaw and Khartoum, the faces of saints still gaze outward. In the texts of Old Nubian, the words of faith still whisper. In the memories of those who dig, study, and remember, the story lives again. This was a civilization of the cross and the Nile, of mud brick and prayer, of resilience and reverence. And now, it is told once more. Let it not be forgotten again. Let it live, not just in books, but in hearts. For the river has remembered. And now, so do we.